That's the same one. Oh, God!
No. Oh, no.
You gotta be kidding me! This is a joke!
No.
This is not funny!
Mike, just please stop. Please stop. Please stop. Please stop. No. No, Mike, it's not the same log. It's not the same log, Mike.
Same one.
Look, it's not.
It is! Open your eyes!
It's not the same log. It's not the same log. It's the same log. It's the same log. It's the same log.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pod and the Pendulum Podcast, the horror movie podcast dedicated to covering every horror movie franchise and series, one movie in one episode at a time. I'm your host, Mike Snoonian, joined once again with my fabulous co-host, Jerry Smith. Jerry, how are we doing?
Fabulous. I'm doing great, man. I'm really excited about this very much.
This, to me, is like one of the scariest movie we've covered to date so far. Like, this is... we're covering it for folks that don't know, because you don't read the episode going into when you're downloading the show, which would be very strange. We are about to embark on our coverage of the Blair Witch Project, which remains the scariest movie I've ever seen in theaters.
You know, it's up there for me, too. I was saying earlier, off the air, that I've only seen the Blair Witch Project 3 times because it scares the living hell out of me. I cannot watch it very often. It's terrifying, I think. Absolutely
agreed. I think there's like a realism to this that it just kind of captured a moment at the time. I remember the first time I watched this movie, walked back into my apartment at like 2 a.m. because I had gone to a midnight screening in Boston when it premiered. And I walked in just as my roommate walked out of his bedroom, and I jumped and screamed like I was like a 4-year-old. So that's what I'll always remember the most. Who do we have with us this week, Jerry?
We have multimedia producer Marcos Codas, which I'm very excited to have on the show. Marcos, how are you doing, man?
I couldn't be better. As I always say, if I was any better, you would have to find me. I'm super excited to talk about my favorite movie of all time. This is a movie that really inspired me to be a filmmaker, so I cannot wait to get into it.
All right, this is going to be great. I have a feeling about it.
Marcos, what is it about? We always like to ask our guests what it is about the movie that we're covering that made them want to jump on board as a guest this week. So tell me a little bit about what it is about the Blair Witch Project that made you want to come on board to talk about it.
Well, to me, it's a mixture of two things. First, on a filmmaking level, the immediacy that exists between the audience and what's going on screen as you watch the film. That drew me in the first time I saw it, and it continues to haunt me to this day, and it's something that I want to emulate every time I do a project. It's something that I'm looking for, to have that, the least resistance between the audience and whatever it is that you're doing. And on a personal level, it means a lot to me because it was my older brother who recommended recommended that I go watch this film. And I was on vacation with my family and took my dad to a dingy theater, and he fell asleep and snored through the whole thing, and I scared myself shitless. So, on a personal level, it means a lot to me. And on a professional level, I think it really it's kind of blurred the boundaries between the audience and the piece, and that really stuck with me.
How many horror movies did your older brother introduce you to? Like, how often was he your gateway into like horror movies or just movies in general?
It's funny because he wasn't prolific in his endeavors, but whenever he said something, let me give you a history of the stuff that he recommended to me. Early 90s was Nirvana and Metallica. And I was 8 or 9 when he was like, "Hey, you should listen to this." And he gave me a Metallica CD because I didn't have a CD player, and he just, told me to go into his room and listen to the Black Album. And a couple of years passed, and then the Blair Witch Project came along, and he was like, you should really give this a shot. I think you're gonna like it. And he didn't say anything else. Like, I didn't know. I was in Uruguay. Like, there was no internet, no nothing. And I didn't know that this wasn't real, And I went into a theater, and while my dad was snoring next to me, these fucking kids were disappearing and shit. So I don't know where we are language-wise. I don't know if we can curse.
Oh, no, you're good.
You can.
Okay,
oh
okay.
no, we're completely blue. Yeah.
Okay. Well, he didn't do it often, but every time he did it, it would really make an impact on my life. So it's really more about the quality rather than the quantity of his recommendations.
Oh,
Very
definitely.
cool.
I can see that. I mean, those are like such huge things to turn someone on to. I mean, Nirvana, Metallica, the Blair Witch Project, those are like 3 very important, in bands or albums or films in their respective art.
I completely agree. And I think he's very much not into like art as a maker himself. He's actually a doctor, so it's very odd to have this image of him growing up where he was kind of my guide into the obscure, and now he's a very well regarded medical professional. It's very odd. It's very hard to reconcile the two brothers that I have, basically. But it's very, very cool. He's a cool cat.
Yeah, I didn't have like an older brother. I just had like a group of friends that would or cousins would every now and then introduce me to some really cool stuff. I remember being like 5 years old and my cousin giving me like a Beatles record and a Queen record. So that was always really neat. But I'd never had the older brother that brought me to the video store or the movie theater and kind of introduced me to some really cool shit as we kind of got older, unfortunately.
I think it was one of the highlights of. Sorry, Mike.
No. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say.
Okay, go ahead. Let's go.
I was just gonna say that it's one of the things that I look back and remember the most fondly is my brother giving me these tips, because I always looked up to him. We were 5 years apart, and I was like the little runt. But whenever he would give me these like Yoda like words of wisdom, they really stuck with me throughout my years.
Definitely. I mean, for me, I never had that. My older brother was always like more interested in like, tagging up places of business and like breaking things. I got into like skateboarding and punk rock and hardcore music very early on myself, just because I was looking for something to identify with. And the only thing I ever had, like my cousin got me into like Death Row Records and like that kind of like gangster rap stuff that I still have such a love for, even though like I'm far from like the, it's not something typically that would be associated with me. But yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, I remember being like in elementary school and kids on the bus listening to like NWA and Eazy-E, and we were this like suburban cow town that had almost as many cows as people in it growing up, and you would see like kids, like these like little white kids in these big puffy Raider jackets listening to Eazy-E. And yeah, so we were like that cliche little town. Like we were definitely that. Like we were straight out of Cliche City. I mean, because there was like zero badasses in our town. We did have funny. A giant.
No. I was
No,
just
you
saying
first.
what is kind of funny and really cool about what we're talking about is some people might think it's off the rails and have nothing to do with the Blair Witch Project, but it does. Because, yeah, like you were saying, it was part of that kind of like town with more cows than people kind of thing. And the same with me. Like looking for punk rock or hardcore is something I identify with because everything else, you didn't identify with. The Blair Witch Project was that first film that was so outside the box and the norm that I feel like a lot of people like us, like just latched onto something so unique like that,
I grew up in a small town as well. We had like a population of 10,000, and there really were like these urban legends surrounding the place, And so by the time I went to the theater to watch the Blair Witch Project, I was like fully primed, because I was raised in this deeply Catholic rural town in the middle of nowhere. And I myself was a huge fan by then of horror films and metal music, and this basically like labeled you satanic where I came from. So it was I was really like almost brought up to find the Blair Witch Project good, and it really didn't disappoint.
Well, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very religious. I grew up in a very religious family, and I always questioned those beliefs. It was something that I didn't really identify with, but I still had that fear because, unfortunately, and I'm not trying to talk down to anyone that has faith because all respect to them, but just for me, my own personal experiences, I was scared to death of the idea of God and all this stuff because every youth group would tell me all about the Satanic Panic era. I mean, that's what I grew up in, the Satanic Panic era, where every single thing was satanic. Every album played backwards was going to kill you or something, and if you don't pray at night, you're going to burn in hell. So when the Blair Witch came out when I was 18 years old, and it was such a really great time for me because I was in the middle of this crossroad of what I did and didn't believe, finally coming to terms with, maybe I don't believe the stuff that I was raised in, but I'm still scared because I have all these fears. And the whole idea of the film really played into that fear that I had my entire life. And I think maybe that's a big reason why to this day I'm just terrified of the movie. It hit me at a time where I was just such a crossroads of who I was and what I believed.
Yeah, I also grew up in a super Catholic household. Like I was an altar boy for a number of years. I actually quit being an altar boy when a new priest started, like after 3 weeks around him. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. And lo and behold, he was one of the priests that had been removed for being abusive towards young boys. Wow. So I kind of dodged a bullet there. It was and it was just this instinct kicked in. And in this little town I grew up in, literally my house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. You would walk out of my house on this path go into these deep woods. We would spend hours growing up, from the ages of 8 to 15 years old. You'd go into the woods, we would build tree forts, we would build forts, we'd play war games. You'd just wander on and off pathways, and it was pretty easy to get lost in them as well, and it could be really spooky out there. And there were tales of witchcraft and ghosts and all this fun stuff growing up. So this movie brought back a ton of memories to me. And Jerry, you had mentioned, questioning things and, questioning what you believe in. For whatever reason, my town's library growing up, because I also grew up in the Satanic Panic era, this little town in the kids section of the library had an absolutely amazing occult section for kids where you could get true vampire stories with these really graphic woodcuts of Vlad the Impaler. Yeah. True life, illustrated true life hauntings, absolutely the most fucked up werewolf and witchcraft books that you could buy, the history of witchcraft for children.
That is so awesome. Did you ever come across that book Lambs to the Slaughter?
I have not come across
that. It was a book that was frequently recommended to parents in the Satanic Panic era, Christian parents, and it dissected every popular art into being this evil thing. I think there was a whole chapter on how evil the Smurfs was. Like, like this book was like notorious for being like the biggest like satanic panic propaganda stuff.
Let's be clear though that the Smurfs are quite odd.
They're odd, yes, but I mean, and what's funny is it was only after reading that book as an adult, as a joke, because I was like, God, I have to read it now that I'm an adult, that I went back and like, you know, the Smurfs opens up with like Gargamel like bowing at a pentagram doing rituals. Like,
Yeah.
like as a kid, I just thought that was awesome.
Onto something there.
Yeah, now that I'm saying that, like, shit, that book was right. No, just kidding.
Yeah. Well, I just think that it's like this, you know, the Blair Witch Project allowed, you know, I think allowed certain people, like if you were open to it, to, because it not only shows, you can't see anything. It doesn't not only show you anything, there are things you just physically can't see, and it makes your mind fill in all the blanks on it. That if you were of a certain age where you got to like really use your imagination to scare the bejesus out of yourself, like it allowed that to come kind of rushing back in.
Well, it succeeded at doing what I think the first Jaws film did. I think that's why Jaws is so terrifying to me still, is because it doesn't show that much until like the last quarter of the film. You know, you watch Jaws the Revenge and you see like that awful looking shark the entire movie. And, you know, and I don't think it's the fact that the shark roars at the end of Jaws the Revenge that ruins the movie. I think it's the fact that there's nothing left to the imagination. And films like Jaws, or more specifically, the Blair Witch Project, I'm glad that we don't see much because, man, it kept me up for weeks, like filling in the blanks in my head about what I think, you know, was there.
Right.
I completely agree, and and that sense of wonder is something that I also kind of have kept in the back of my mind. And I was watching, my wife and I were watching E.T. last night, and it was my first time watching the film.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I know, right?
No,
well,
I
watched a hell of a lot of Starship Troopers, so I didn't have time for E.T.
Oh, right.
growing up. But yeah, I was watching it, and it was a masterpiece of showing just enough. And to me, that's also sort of what, and when we start getting into the inspiration behind the Blair Witch Project, a lot of what inspired these guys to make the film was the fact that, you know, the unknown and what could be out there, but we don't know. I think that plays a lot into why this and other things are successful, and I really much prefer watching something like this rather than something that, you know, shows everything in a single go.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the conception of the movie. And I think it's impossible to talk about the Blair Witch Project and why it's so successful without delving pretty deep into the background of it overall.
Oh, definitely.
Because I think that the two things are so intrinsically tied together that you have to do that. So co-directors Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick, along with their producer Greg Hale, kind of all meet up and become friends at the University of Central Florida. And part of what they bond over, Myrick and Sanchez in particular, is their love of like these shocky exploitation shows that you would have seen in the late 70s and early 80s, like Ripley's Believe It or Not or In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy. These were shows that basically presented the paranormal as real, or at least said that there's a possibility that the paranormal is real. And they were cheesy, they were schlocky, but they were, you know, a bit subversive and transgressive as well for all the cheese that was there.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of those shows. Like, and I think it's a funny touch to have like Leonard Nimoy host that, or like what's the one that Jonathan Frakes from Next Generation hosts? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Hold on, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jonathan Frakes from Star Trek, he hosts one within the last few years where it's basically kind of like this generation's take on those things. And
it's become a meme, hasn't it?
Yeah,
you're
totally.
right.
Yeah, totally. It takes
I think it's
kind of like
beyond belief.
Beyond belief.
Yes. Fact or fiction.
It's hilarious because you watch him and he's so committed to like the whole shtick of it that, you know, even if it's false, it's so fun to watch that journey of each episode because like the way it's presented. And I think that love of shows like that is very prevalent in, I think, Blair Witch and what Sanchez and Myrick put together.
Absolutely, and
Jerry-
you gotta remember that the whole thing about why In Search of and shows like that worked was because of the setup, because of how they built up the story around it, and that's why Leonard Nimoy was there. He was basically the puppet master, behind the whole thing, orchestrating the storytelling around it so that you would be sucked into the story. And that's kind of what happens as well with the film. Eventually, when it gets done, is that the lore is so gripping that by the time you're presented with the stuff that's happening to the three guys out in the woods, you are completely convinced that something is actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the lore is what really, I think, in a lot of ways, is a jar of this movie. And both Sanchez, Myrick, and Hale as well, they start before they have a script. They start basically coming up with the mythology of this movie. Starting with Ellie Keddard, the old woman who during the 1700s was banished from the township of Blair after kids report that she's a witch. The town banishes her. They come up with the idea of her being banished from the town. I think she's like, according to lore, tied to a tree and then basically left for dead out in the middle of the woods. Mm-hmm. Everyone presumes she's dead. Only a year later, all the kids that accused her of being a witch had gone missing. And there's an obvious inspiration coming from the Salem witch trials of 1692, where girls like Ann Putnam and her friends accused the servant Tituba of being a witch and doing black magic, and then accusing others of witchcraft, which led to the hanging deaths of, I think, 19 women, and then one male being pressed to death by a bunch of rocks because he didn't want to give up his land, basically, if he admitted he was a witch. So there's obviously inspiration drawn from American history, but they build out from there. Aside from the initial legend of the witch, there's the girl that is pulled under the stream. They add the story of Coffin Rock, where one girl disappears. The search party that goes to look for her is found eviscerated on a rock with their guts kind of torn open and them tied into some weird symbol. And then obviously the story of Rustin Parr. What do you guys think of like the Rustin Parr myth or backstory? Because that to me was like the creepiest bit and probably the one that ties most into what goes on in the movie.
Well, it's scary as hell, man. I think that not only the Rustin Parr stuff, but basically all of that mythology adds to, I think, the appeal and the effect of the film. You have so many other series that started with one movie, and then after the fact, they act like it was a big plan. I mean, Star Wars came out, it was a big hit, then George Lucas says, oh, never mind, it's called A New Hope during the re-release, and it's a trilogy. Slasher movies today, one successful, and then suddenly like, oh no, this was always going to be a series. Whereas Blair Witch, like you said, they built that mythology from the ground up, and they made sure each of these stories, these backstories, this whole mythology was gonna scare the hell out of their viewers before they even rolled the camera. And I think that that's a testament to how smart and savvy that both of those filmmakers were.
If I could just interject for a little bit. It's very, when we're talking about the backbone of the story surrounding, the lore of the Blair Witch Project, it's very important to bring up Ben Rock, who ended up being production designer on the film. And he developed a lot of the sort of the backstory that ended up being used for what would become phase 2 of shooting, and ended up being Curse of the Blair Witch and the Burkittsville 7 eventually, the story of Rustin Parr, and we'll talk about that in a bit, I'm sure. But it was really Ben Rock that was tasked with this, mammoth endeavor of creating the mythology around the backstory of the Blair Witch. Eduardo and Daniel were focusing on getting the film made with Greg, and eventually, the Haxan Five, as they would become known, would get the logistics going. But it was Ben Rock who developed a lot of
really fleshed it out and stuff.
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Right. Well, Rock is going to eventually take a lot of the material that's left on the cutting room floor when they decide to reshape the movie, and that's where you're going to get the Curse of the Blair Witch. So you're right, he was instrumental in coming up with a lot of this backstory initially, and then he also is really the one responsible, I think, for driving a lot of the, I would say, intrigue about the movie right before its initial release with the Curse of the Blair Witch. And we're definitely going to talk more about that shortly here. And we're actually going to be speaking to Ben Rock at some point next week to talk about the Burkittsville 7 as well as the Curse of the Blair Witch, because those two on their own are great. Yeah, and we have
that's why
another
we had
guest
to,
lined up.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's like two of the other guests that we're eventually going to have for our BLAIR series. Like, we kind of had to schedule a time to where they could have like entire episodes on just them, because it's going to be so extensive. I think those guys.
This is my. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like, is I can take, the other two movies I've got various feelings on, but I could do just like a podcast. As many episodes as we did on Friday the 13th, I feel like I could do that
just on
this movie. Yeah, just this one movie, not even the whole series.
See, isn't that exciting though? That's exciting because how like just animated and excited I was for every Friday the 13th episode, and God knows it's going to be
Especially
5 times worse
9.
for Halloween. Yeah, right. But it's going to be 5 times worse for the Halloween episodes. But it's cool that we have the Blair Witch for you.
Jerry, I really like your point about how they built this mythology from the ground up, and I think that hits it on the head, as opposed to going back and doing like retcons or making it sound like, oh, we had this all figured out from the get-go. And I think that stands, say, in sharp contrast to the series that you could most directly compare this to, which is Paranormal Activity, which is another movie I absolutely love. Like, I think it's a phenomenal movie, but I think that the other films suffer after the first movie because they were tied or tried to create a mythology whole cloth that wasn't necessarily there from the get-go. They try to fit things in.
Oh, no, totally. And briefly, just speaking on Paranormal Activity for a second, I feel like that series, the only entries in that series that really worked for me were the ones that kind of did their own thing. Like, I love the first one. I love the third one because out of nowhere witches are involved. And I think the marked ones is probably my favorite because it's such a variation from what we've seen. I think that when it's not planned from the beginning, it shows even when you try to bring them all together with this mythology. Whereas like we're saying with the Blair Witch Project, Ben Rock and Sanchez, Myrick, all them, like, they wanted to give their viewers an experience. And like, I think almost out of every film in the history of filmmaking, Blair Witch is probably, the first time you see it, probably one of the 10 best experiences that you could have, and it's because of that.
I completely agree. And let's not forget though that much like the Paranormal Activity series, at least the first official sequel to the Blair Witch Project kind of threw away all of the mythos created by the guys and sort of went its own way in terms of like plot and backstory and shooting style, just because Lionsgate was really keen to release a sequel very quickly. So I think if we're measuring with the same stick, I think we kind of have to acknowledge that the sequel was a little bit on the rushed side and didn't capitalize on the rich history that these guys built on.
I remember after the film came out, the first Blair Witch Project film, there was an Entertainment Weekly issue that ran, and it had an interview with Eduardo and Daniel. And I think Ben Rock might have been involved. I could be wrong. And they talked about how they had this whole idea for a series and all these directions that they wanted to go. So it feels like right from the beginning, they knew what they wanted to do. It just feels like Lionsgate had other plans for, every other thing.
Yeah, they've talked openly because they've wanted to make more Blair Witch movies ever since the success of the first one, but either Lionsgate or Artisan at the time was going to rush them to make a sequel, which are like, nope, we can't just like rush one out. This takes time. Or Lionsgate just, didn't want to go in the direction that Daniel and Eduardo wanted to go into. I'm hoping we get to talk about that more in depth with them in the future, but we'll see what happens.
And I'll only touch on this briefly because this is the episode on the first film, but what I have always found really interesting is you get a film like the Blair Witch Project, which is, very cinema verite kind of documentary kind of style. And then you get one of the best documentarian filmmakers to direct a narrative for the second film, and it's a disaster. Like, I to this day, I still don't know how that didn't work because Berlinger's like so huge for me as far as documentaries.
He almost gets a pass just because the Paradise Lost documentaries are so good and so impactful.
Even Whitey. I mean, God, man, that guy can make them.
Yeah. But I think we're going to end up talking about him a little bit at the end of the episode and his opinion of what the Blair Witch Project was. And I know we're going to get more in depth on it next week. If you ever want to hear me rage, definitely tune in when we cover the Book of Shadows, because like that is a Mandy level of epic fail in terms of like,
oh my God,
like a movie for me. It's one of the only movies I've ever, when I've left the theater, I was like physically angry at a movie and wanted to punch people for how bad it was.
A big reason, I can understand that. A big reason that is how well the first film works, And
what's interesting is, the piece that accompanies that Ben Rock produced for Book of Shadows works so much better in terms of tone, in terms of narrative, and in terms of being scary than what the Book of Shadows becomes. Like, it's the third piece and probably the one that's least known overall. I'm actually drawing a blank on the name of it right now because this always happens to me. But it's so much better than Book of Shadows in like the 45 minutes that it actually runs.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally think that as far as, the spirit of the first film is concerned, I think Burkittsville 7 and Curse of Blair Witch are much closer than Book of Shadows or 2016's Blair Witch ever made it. And I think the error actually is in trying to follow the original story so closely. Because of how well it was made, I don't think the sequels should have stayed that close to the original source material. That's why I think Burkittsville 7 is by far my favorite.
Yeah, Burkittsville 7 is very interesting.
Yeah.
Burkittsville 7 is very interesting in terms of what it does, and I think we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So we talked a little bit about the concept of how they've come up with this mythology overall with it. I find the Rustin Parr stuff extremely creepy, especially as it's presented in The Curse of the Blair Witch. The old footage they show of him and just like the reporters kind of haranguing him and then him just kind of getting up with that creepy smile on his face. But the story behind that is like Rustin Parr is this old hermit out in the middle of nowhere in the woods, luring, and all these children start disappearing one at a time until he reemerges from the woods and says it's finished. And no one knows what he's talking about. They go out to his old cabin, and lo and behold, the 7 missing kids are there. All have been murdered by him. One kid managed to escape, and he says, well, I did it because the ghost of the witch told me to do it.
How did you kill the children, Mr. Parr?
With knives.
Mr. Parr, were you alone in the killings?
Yes.
Mr. Parr, how did you get the children into the woods?
Promised them things.
What kind of things, Mr. Parr?
Candy.
Do you kill other children that we don't know about, Mr. Parr?
No. Over here, Mr. Parr. Mr. Parr, why those 7 children?
That's what the voices told me.
Mr. Parr, the writings on the wall in your house, what do they mean? What were the writings on the wall, Mr. Parr? Did you write those? Did you write on the walls?
No.
Mr. Parr, you've been sentenced to death. Do you feel this is fair?
Yes.
Mr. Parr, do you think God has forgiven you?
Yes.
Have you asked a priest for absolution?
Yes.
Have members of your family been deceived?
No.
Interview's over. Mr. Parr, was it Satan?
He's obviously convicted and hung. And his story is kind of the last episode in the Burkittsville Woods before the events of the Blair Witch Project. So before even like a reel of film is shot, you have this really rich, detailed backstory that's going to inform everything that goes on for the 85 minutes of the Blair Witch Project. And it's just incredibly detailed and so well laid out. And it's not just background for the sake of background, but it moves to kind of move the story forward as well.
Mm-hmm.
And let's remember that the actors were not given scripts per se, but rather clues during the shoot. So all they had to work with was this lore that they created, and they had to make their performances. They had to base them on both the clues that they were given on each day and the lore.
Absolutely.
So I think it was a brilliant decision to do the filmmaking that way, and I think it's one of the reasons why it stands out. So between the other films.
What it is the perfect juxtaposition of great acting and great reacting. You know, like some of it is they're so in character. The main three, they're so in character that it's convincing. But at the same time, they really didn't know what was going on. So it's both great acting and just being observant to your surroundings and reacting to them the way that they really would.
Yeah, and they were very uncomfortable. Like they were put through some stuff, those three. So I think a lot of it was just real frustration at the environment and the situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So before we get into that, because I think I want to dive much deeper into that, and Marcos, you're spot on in terms of like just how little. I mean, the Blair Witch script is 35 pages long.
Yeah.
That's it. It's like this what you would find in like a long short movie, basically, and it sets up all of the scenes, but Myrick and Sanchez are going to put enormous amounts of trust in their crew, their actors, in terms of carrying out their vision. And I don't think that can be stated enough. Like, they had to have a lot of faith in not only their editing abilities to actually put together a movie with what they got, but that they hired the right crew of people to carry out their vision and to interpret that vision, because so much is left in the hands of the actors. Okay, so here's my question. Have either of you seen like kind of the 8 to 10 minute short film that played on split screen? That
I haven't.
Okay, Marcos, have you seen this?
I have not, but I have seen something else that other people may not have seen that is quite interesting. I don't know if I can talk about it much, but I've seen a documentary that was being made on the making of the Blair Witch Project that contains some very cool information. But I'll talk about it as we go along. But
okay,
this short film that you're mentioning that was eventually used to shop around for funding and stuff. It is mentioned, and there was some cool backstory there. I just think I kind of dug myself into a legal hole, but the thing is, though, I have not seen the film, but I have seen what happened before and how that film influenced production. And it really is such a clever way of pitching a different idea. And it just goes to show that they really sort of had to try a different way of filmmaking, even during pre-production, just to get this thing done.
Right. So this, and we'll put a link to because up on YouTube, the episode, it's shown on a television show that ran on the independent film channel back in the mid to late 90s called Split Screen, hosted by John Pearson, kind of a wealthy entrepreneur that had a real passion for the arts that, would, kick funds in and produce a lot of independent films. And he hosted the show on IFC as a way to kind of like kickstart and show off a number of like independent film projects and drum up interest in them. So Sanchez and Myrick make about a 10-minute, what I would call like a pitch reel, basically. And it lays out all of the backstory to the Blair Witch. It lays out Rustin Parr. It lays out Ellie Kedward. It lays out everything about the girl that disappeared. It lays out the fact that 3 students filmed a documentary, were out to film a documentary, and that they disappeared, and a year later their footage was found overall. And it runs about 10 minutes long, and it's meant to act as like a pitch reel. Message boards, it's not presented as fiction. Like when they show this, they don't say like, here's this new independent horror movie coming out that's presented as truth, but is actually like a fictional movie. They just put the information out there and let the audience decide what's going on with it. So brilliant. Message boards, as they work, because this is like the early days of the internet, they begin to light up, and all these people are trying to quote unquote solve the mystery of what they saw on this. One quick note about John Pearson: at the time he was on the programming board of Sundance, he saw this short, obviously hosted it, was really intrigued by it. He kicks in $10,000 of his own funds in order to help this movie get made. There's kind of like the rumor or assumption that like when the last broadcast was submitted to Sundance in 98, he was like, nah, we're not going to show this one. Doesn't quite make the cut, knowing that Blair Witch Project would be ready to go a year later. So he had maybe a reason to kind of keep that movie out. But people are like, when Pearson interviews, or he kind of questions Myrick and Sanchez about the movie, like, what happened to these people? What do you know? Where are they? They're like, dude, this is fictional, right? Like, none of this happened. Like, he was completely taken in, and he's like, here is a check. You guys need to make this feature movie.
You know what's great about John Pearson is that guy had a hand in so many up-and-coming filmmakers and believed in them. I mean, Spike Lee, Kevin Smith, Clerks would not have been what it was without John Pearson. That guy, he had such a passion for independent cinema, and I don't think he gets enough credit. I had no idea that he had anything to do with Blair Witch prior to this. That is so awesome. And
just on the subject of the last broadcast, it was such a kerfuffle. Particularly just as the Blair Witch Project started to take off, that they were sort of ripping each other off. But as you mentioned, and I'm looking over your notes, the reality is that Blair Witch was like, it was created before the last broadcast was even a thing. Like finished thing, at least. They were sort of simultaneously developed independently of each other. And I think that rumor it's funny because whenever I think that rumor has been well and truly dead for like 2 decades, somebody pops up on a YouTube comment and is like, oh, but there's this movie in 1998 called The Last Broadcast. Yeah. And, as if you can make the Blair Witch in a year as a response to the last broadcast, And it's just funny to me that the rumor has never died, even though it's been 20 years since it's been debunked.
So let's do this now. Let's talk about the last broadcast comparisons now, because I had this for like at the end of my notes here, but now's a good time to do it, I think.
Yeah, let's go into it.
Well, I think that, that's how I came across the last broadcast, is because even the video stores that I was at, was kind of comparing them hand in hand.
Mhm.
I mean, any time that you would go for the Blair Witch, if it wasn't there, someone would say, "Well, you should check out the last broadcast." You know, like I think that the films, even if they were independent of each other, I think they're always gonna be held side by side, just kind of like the way that Friday the 13th and Halloween was.
Right.
You know, and the thing about the last broadcast, you know, to be honest, it's a pretty effective movie until the last reveal, which
Yes.
kills the entire film. And I think the last broadcast will always be held up to Blair Witch, but in complete honesty, I just think one of them is light years better, and maybe shouldn't be held up to each other, you know?
If the Blair Witch didn't hit like a meteor that really took everybody, audiences, critics, like everyone by surprise, I don't think anybody would ever talk about the last broadcast. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the movie, although I guess it is, but I just think it's like not a kind of movie that would be that memorable otherwise.
I have to agree. And let's not forget that the Blair Witch Project was not just a film. It was a fantastic marketing effort. And, you know, yeah, exactly. And I know we're going to talk about that a little more in a bit, but when comparing, inevitably, when comparing the two films, you see, I think, a difference both in quality of the final product and a difference in the way the films are presented, and the way the films are shot, and the way the films feel in terms of how immediate they are to the action of what's happening. And I think for me, that's the biggest difference between the two of them, is that the last broadcast feels like it was made to look like it was real, while the Blair Witch Project feels real.
Right. The fascinating thing about the last broadcast is, and I think the intent of the two movies are different. The Blair Witch Project is the Blair Witch Project just wants to scare the hell out of you. That's at the core of it. Like, it just wants you to walk out of the theater feeling scared. The last broadcast isn't really a horror movie per se, although it deals with horrific things. Last broadcast intent feels like it is looking at truth in media and whether you can trust with your own eyes and your own ears what you're being presented. It's pretty fascinating, and I think it's something, especially now, it's a message that very much resonates when we talk about deep fakes and fake news and doctored video and, you know, these bot accounts that spring up, especially around political arguments. Like, well, what can you really trust? Like, it's based around what seems to be a very cut and dry case where the antagonist of the movie, Jim Seward, goes crazy and murders the hosts of this like down and out little, you know, kind of like we talked, you know, cable access paranormal TV show. He goes out, fact or fiction. He goes out and kills those guys in cold blood. And it looks very much like he would be the guilty party of it. And midway through the film, it suggests, well, maybe that's not actually what happened. Maybe we can't really believe what we've been presented with as fact overall, and it calls that into question. Unfortunately, it completely falls apart in the last reel when it goes from being a documentary style piece to kind of like your third, you know, regular old dramatic film at that point for the last 5 minutes.
What it's always felt like to me, and I don't mean to diss April Fool's Day, because I love that original film. It feels kind of like the ending of that movie, where you think it's one thing, and at the end, it's basically all just a big joke. You know, like, I don't want to be invested in a film like The Last Broadcast and be so interested in it, and then what happens at the end happens, and you're like, what? I feel robbed of this whole experience that I just went through. Whereas Blair Witch, you know, like, I walked out of that theater changed. And that sounds dramatic, but like I said, I've only seen it 3 times in my life because it still has that effect on me.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I think if we really think about it, you know, Pearson was on the Sundance, you know, committee and stuff, and that could be the case. But what I really think it is, the reason Last Broadcast was probably passed up is because it's really not that good of a movie.
Agree.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like kind of like what Marcos was saying. That rumor, it is always brought up, but at the same time, I mean, like I said, I just think Last Broadcast isn't that good. You know what I mean?
I would say the one thought or idea that's come out and I think in no way has a Blair Witch ever ripped off The Last Broadcast. I know that it came out like September of '98. It's what it does hold the distinction of is being the first movie ever beamed digitally into cinemas through satellites, which I don't think is a very common thing even now, to be quite fair. And Myrick and Sanchez see it. They've already filmed The Blair Witch. They're editing at this point, and they see this movie. They're like, oh shit, like people are going to accuse us of ripping it off. Or also they kind of see like the way that movie is structured, similar to The Blair Witch at that point, where it was more of a documentary at that point. You were seeing the things in The Curse of the Blair Witch was added into the actual movie. And then the last third or half hour of the movie was going to be Heather, Mike, and Josh lost in the woods. Mm-hmm. When they come out of The Last Broadcast, they're like, this doesn't really work. What really works is the documentary parts of it. Maybe we should resculpt or restructure our movie. That's been the one suggestion to me that maybe holds any water. But to me, it's not a big deal. Like, it's just like you're editing the movie anyway. You're going to go for what works. You already have all your footage.
Yeah. I cannot wait until you ask that question of Eduardo. I'm really looking forward to hearing that because, as you mentioned during the filming process, a lot of stuff that they filmed for Phase 2, what they call Phase 2 of the film, didn't make it into the main film, and I'm really now curious, and I was curious ever since I read your notes about this idea that the Last Broadcast played a role in them dumping the Phase 2 stuff out of the film. So I'm really looking forward to that.
And again, I don't even think it's from a point of view as like we're going to look too much like this movie. I think it was more of the point of like, oh,
this didn't work in that.
It doesn't really work. But the things that do work are the actual parts where these guys are in the woods like a bunch of schlubs way in over their heads. Like those are the fascinating bits. Everything with the everything that was like the interview and the narration, like that stuff is like, I watched it again recently over holiday when I was taking my notes for this. I'm like, just want to really see how much these two stack up. And I'm like, this is a chore to get through at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it works on its own. I think it definitely would have brought the film down, particularly in terms of pace. But I think from a narrative standpoint, I think what ended up on The Curse of the Blair Witch, I think it really stands up on its own as an add-on, kind of a DLC type thing to the main film. I personally find it enjoyable, but then again, I'm the guy who, reads the message boards from like 20 years ago. So maybe I'm not like general audience material, but I found it to be enjoyable even to this day.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are bits I really like. I think knowing that end is coming up at this point is what really kind of colors it for me a little bit. So, because and for folks that haven't seen it, the person who had, and like, please don't get mad that I'm spoiling like a 20-something-year-old movie at this point. The person who is narrating this whole documentary is revealed to be the killer, and it's a reveal that is done in the most incredibly awkward way. And the last 5 minutes of that movie are like near unwatchable to me.
And that's The Last Broadcast?
That's The Last Broadcast.
Okay, yeah. For a second I thought you were talking about some of the Blair Witch stuff.
No, I was talking about the Curse of the Blair Witch, just to be clear.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that's where we got like mixed up right now. Oh no, Mike was talking about The Last Broadcast becoming a chore. Not The Curse of the Blair Witch.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I apologize. I misunderstood. Yeah. No, I agree that The Last Broadcast, I found it hard to go back to as well. I watched it last year, and I did find it like, well, what's going on, guys? Let's move this thing along. It's a little bit of a slog. And yeah, the ending. And the funny thing about the ending is that when Artisan and Lionsgate were doing their thing, looking to distribute the Blair Witch Project, they had the guys film different endings because they weren't satisfied with the one that they had, and they ended up using the original ending anyway. So endings in general for films are a little bit of a important subject, I would say.
Oh yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so can we put the last broadcast to bed?
Right,
yes.
The last.
Okay,
yes, the last.
excellent, excellent. That we'll never speak of that movie again. So let's dive in. Marcos, you had touched on this a little bit with the discomfort of the actors and the performers. So they go out, they hire 3 actors with a decent amount of improv experience overall: Heather Donahue, Michael Williams, and Joshua Leonard. Hand them like this bare bones 35-page script, and they tell them, look, your safety is very important to us, but your comfort is not. Marcos, you seem to know this pretty well. Why don't you talk a little bit about the discomfort that these guys were put through when filming this movie?
Absolutely. I think we got to start at the beginning. And I would say that the beginning for these 3 is Josh's audition tape, because he didn't make it into the original audition sessions in New York, and he taped in his audition. And they were so taken by his performance that they hired him basically on the spot, and it was him that brought Heather on board for the film. So they were already pretty close and very trusty of the performance capabilities of Josh and Heather in particular. Mike was the last one to come on board, and they sort of devised this guerrilla filmmaking scenario where they would leave the guys in the woods, and they would leave packages, basically some notes as to what their characters were going to do that day, and GPS coordinates, and they left everything else up to the 3 performers. And this was because Greg Hale, and he was the one who came up with the idea of using this emerging technology as it was back then, GPS, to due to his army training, to guide the guys around and not interfere with them directly, like not interact with them directly. And they were in true discomfort. They didn't have access to like bathrooms. They didn't have like trailers that they could back to after a shoot. They were out in the woods for real. And some of the nights were like really, really scary and really fucked up. You could see in some of the behind the scenes shots when the guys get back that they were not in good shape. Like they lost weight. They were like, they hadn't been sleeping. It was real. As you said, their safety was very important to the production team. They were always like, I think it was like 200 or 300 feet a perimeter that they had around the performers, and they had like camouflage gear on, and they were using scopes to make sure that they were okay, and they had a safe word. But aside from that,
I believe it's taco was the safe word.
Yes. And
taco is my safe word.
Mine is Fozzie Bear.
I do not have a safe word. I think I should come up with one, particularly since I'm married now. Yes. I think I'm just very boring, and I just think I would go with help. But
that's great.
So you had mentioned Greg Hale's army training. Greg Hale was had training in something called SIR, or Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, which basically, think of the movie First Blood, and you have a pretty good idea of what this training is. You would have one person in the army who was given a little bit of a head start, and then he was hunted by his platoon mates. And his goal was to survive and evade capture for as long as possible. And the idea is, even though you know that it's training and that if you get captured, you're not going to become a prisoner of war or killed in battle, your mind still goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and it treats it like reality. So Greg Hale took this Army training and basically said, we are going to use this on 3 untrained civilians as they go camping in the woods for 8 days while we film this horror movie. And I think that's why, to your point, Marcos, so much of what you see in this movie feels real, because it was real to them, because they were tired, they were scared, they were hungry. Not only did they get those notes every day with bare bones instruction, this is what you're going to do, and coordinates, and all of them were given different notes, they were given less food every day, to the point where by day 8, they were down to like a power bar and a banana to get through that day.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys know, but I was actually in the army as well. Though obviously not in the U.S., but I was in the Paraguayan army, and by the end of our first year, we had to do survival training, and like it's real. Like your body does not know the difference between, okay, this is just a simulation. Like your body goes into, okay, we gotta get out of this shit because it's about to fucking break. And after the first couple of nights when you're with very little sleep under this amount of tension, and no food barely other than what you're able to catch yourself or whatever is given to you as a pittance almost, like your body is ready to like, okay, let's go. It's incredible how real that situation becomes to your body and to your senses and to your psyche once you start getting into the psychological games of sleep deprivation and like food deprivation. It's very uncomfortable, and we were ready. Like we have been going through very hardcore training for a year before we were put into this, and this was just 3 actors that were just thrown into the deep end for 8 days. So as you mentioned, a lot of what you see is real discomfort, and I think that plays very well into the hands of the directors.
So how long did it take for that to feel real? First, how long did that training last for you?
It was 3 days for us, and by the morning of the second day, it was full on, because one of my platoon mates lost his rifle. And when you're in the army, like your platoon is your family. So because he lost his rifle, all of us had to like pay. So it was very uncomfortable, and we were basically the most junior unit out there. And by the time we ended the training, we came back into the base feeling like we could take down the commander, because you feel like so extremely pumped, and it's a very difficult feeling to describe, the stuff that you go through when you're doing that kind of stuff.
When your platoon mate lost his rifle, how did you and the others in the platoon look at him or begin to feel about him when he lost his rifle and you knew that you were going to all suffer consequences for that?
Well, I think now that you mention it, I never drew the parallel, and this is your interviewing skills at work. And you're asking this because of the map. And I think it was a very similar reaction that was like, oh, fuck, it's him again. And it was him again. You know what I mean? It was the guy that always fucked up. And, he lost. How can you lose a rifle? Like, it's not, your car keys, it's a big thing. And he woke up and the rifle wasn't there. I don't know if someone was fucking him, but to this day, I don't know what the fuck happened to that rifle. I just know that it showed up later that day, but we wanted to kill that guy. Because we knew that we had gone through some extreme hardship, and even more was coming our way just because that crazy guy couldn't keep his hands on his rifle for the night.
Just like the film and the map. You're right.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Once you guys get back, you mentioned like you felt really powerful. You felt like you could take down the commander at that point, even though you mentioned you were the junior squad at that point. How long does it take like your body and your mind to return to what would be like a resting state from that feeling of like being really elevated?
For me, the thing that you gotta remember is that we went back into regular training, so I didn't really come back all the way down into sort of civilian mode.
Mm-hmm.
I was still at the base doing training. So, but even still, it took me a couple of days of getting knocked around by the senior guys to realize my place again. You know, because they were not happy when we came back. They were like, "Why are these bunch of weebs being all insubordinate all of a sudden?" You know, and it took us a good couple of days to get back into the rhythm of things. And when I left the army after that year, because it's mandatory here, you have a couple of different ways of doing it. And I went for reserve officer training, which is kind of like the hardest you could possibly do while still remaining a civilian afterwards. And like it took me a good couple of months to not twitch when people talk to me. And, you know, I still get nightmares from time to time. So it was no joke. So I cannot imagine what you know, these three guys, I do wonder if they still have nightmares about what happened, because I sure do. And, you know, I don't know. It's very interesting.
Well,
and
it's filmmaking that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, and it's interesting that a film as small at the time as the Blair Witch Project utilized such heavy and intense and outside the box, you know, ways to approach it. Like I have so much respect for them for doing that. It's so interesting to me.
I don't think it could be allowed, to be honest. Like, I don't think it would be allowed now. And when I was doing my own film, I was looking into making it look as if it was real. And I realized that Paraguayan law forbids you from faking a crime. So I think a lot of laws have moved on.
Interesting. So
I don't think it could be made now.
I think that it couldn't be made as it is. You definitely couldn't make it with like a union crew. There'd be so many rules against that. There'd be just zero chance of that ever being done. It certainly couldn't be marketed as it is right now, because it exists in this perfect time where the internet is just prevalent enough where almost everybody has access to it in some way, shape, or form and knows how to use it. But there's not things like Google and social media where things can be proven or disproven or argued in about 10 seconds.
Well, that, and I mean, it seems like every film these days has this interesting viral marketing. You know, the Blair Witch kind of created that in a lot of ways. Now, if you go on Twitter and you like a tweet about a Blumhouse movie, the characters tweet back. You know what I mean? Like every film does this stuff. Right. Like, you know, I was getting weirded out because the lead character of Ma was tweeting me because I liked a post. You know what I mean? Like every single movie does that. Whereas like the Blair Witch Project, it was unheard of at that point. And I think that's maybe. And see, the more I'm talking about it, the more it makes sense why it scared the shit out of me. I had never experienced something like that. And to this day, I don't think I've ever experienced something like that again. Like just the wonder, the excitement, the scares, being terrified, but not knowing where the fine line between reality and fiction was.
Absolutely. And I just lost track of thought because you were so on point right there. So I think that pretty much nails it. It's to me, in 1999 when this came out, was probably the height of my pro wrestling fandom as well. And it was the height of, like, say, Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was the biggest star in the world at that point for pro wrestling. And as I'm watching it, I'm like, I know wrestling is fake. I know that it's all scripted. But, man, when this guy comes out, I really want to believe it's real. And Blair Witch did that for me. Like, I'm sitting in the theater, like, I know this is a movie. I know that it's fiction. But it's presented in just enough with enough reality to it that I really want to buy in to what I'm seeing is real, and that doesn't exist anymore.
What's interesting is a friend of mine threw this kind of like very small little film festival at his house recently. He directed the film Starfish, and he invited just a few people over to his house to have this kind of like weekend-long film festival. And we were talking about Blair Witch because his podcast, Weird Geeks, is also doing the Blair Witch series kind of now, and it's been great listening to it. But we were talking about Blair Witch, and he said that he saw it opening night in New York, and they had all three of the leads, their outfits on display, and they were still marketing it as something very real.
Yep.
And man, that experience, like, it will never be recaptured by, I think, any film.
No, there'll be nothing like that again. I know I would strongly recommend for anyone to go and listen to the We the Geeks podcast, because you get to hear everything we're saying, but with a sexy British accent, as opposed to my Boston accent. So
I'm from the Central Valley in California. Like, I just say rad too much.
You're just a valley girl at heart, Jerry.
Pretty much.
So we were talking about how not only would the actors get these little notes in milk bottles, and all of them, they would not be given the same information. So, for example, Michael was told, "You're going to lose the map." Joshua and Heather were not given the note, "Michael is going to lose the map." They were just going to react when that is, you're going to be given a piece of information today that's crucial, react to it. The other thing that happened, there was a mix of professional actors and townspeople that Michael, Heather, and Joshua would go interview, and they didn't know who was who. And Marcos, you made the point, like, they were revealed these bits of information little at a time, and then they would have to go, like, they had no idea who Mary Brown was until they interviewed that man outside the grocery store who said, "Oh yeah, you should really talk to Mary Brown." And then they would have to go find her. So it was kind of like filmmaking by way of scavenger hunt.
Yeah, and to me, Mary Brown is a turning point in the film, because she is the first actor outside of the three that, to me, feels like she is kind of the perfect embodiment of what the Blair Witch Project is. Because she is one weird lady. And the thing is that even the filmmakers were weirded out, like in real life, by her, by the actress that plays Mary Brown. So I think she is the turning point. And looking back, now knowing that the film, it's a film, right? It's not real life. And I think I'm the only one of the three that thought the film was real going into the film, right? So looking back now, I think that's the point where you can say, okay, this performance is so good that even knowing that the film is just a film and it's not real life, it still holds this suspension of disbelief so strongly that, and it rests on these performances so much that this is going to work. And for me, that point is Mary Brown.
I watched the film this last week. My kids were over, and I thought we'd have like a movie night. And, I needed to revisit it to prepare for this episode. So I watched it, and I was like, I'm going to scare the shit out of my kids. And we watched it, and my kids were asleep by the time the Mary Brown character shows up. So they were just like, whatever, this is boring. But even knowing 100% it's fiction, it's 2019. We already know by now that Blair Witch is not real. But even still, that character scared the shit out of me.
She's so unnerving.
I cannot make it through this movie, even today, without just being on the edge of my seat.
Well, it's her voice. It's the way she moves. And she looks like someone who's been touched by horrific evil and never recovered from it.
Yeah, she looks like she was, like, her soul was sucked out of her mouth, like, 150 years ago, and she just never died. She looks like properly weird, and it was perfect casting. And to me, even to this day, that's the turning point of, okay, this film is gonna work based on the performances alone.
Because something interesting happened to you actually at one point in your life. You had an encounter with the Blair Witch.
Yes, that is a really kind of scary story. To kind of make ends meet, my dad and I would go fishing down by Taffy's Creek.
Right.
And, it's in Burkittsville. I was laying down on the leaves, a pile of leaves, kind of watching my pole and looking up at the sky.
Sure.
And all of a sudden I felt like something was near me.
Right.
Kind of an eerie feeling. It was like a woman, only on her arm, on her hands and everything. it was like hair, like a real dark, almost black hair, like a horse.
Like fur?
Yeah, like a fur, like horse fur. Then her arms, she had like a shawl,
Right.
wool shawl over her.
And she scared you? She threatened
And
you?
she didn't say anything, but she just kept staring. And then she
Right.
opened up her shawl,
And what was under there?
and under it there was hair on her body, like a
So she
horse.
was hairy from head to toe.
Yeah, and her legs and you could see
Right, how
she
about
was
her
a
face?
female, with just kind of like strange looking.
Here's another thing I love about the decisions that Myrick and Sanchez made with the movie. Not only do they give these different townspeople and actors pieces of information about the mythology of the Blair Witch, they also give them contradictory bits of information that is just a little bit off from one another, which to me, if you were to go to a town that had a lot of folklore and a lot of history to it and a lot of oral tradition, if you were to ask 10 different people about that history, all 10 of them are going to have slight variations of how they know the story. And that adds to that reality and that suspension of disbelief, because there's just enough truth in what they're saying to, okay, they know what they're talking about, but they're also contradicting one another a little bit.
No, it's a testament to acting too. You know, or like I said, reacting earlier. You know, Heather and Josh not knowing that, you know, the other guy was going to lose the map. Like you can tell, there's actual venom being spewed. You know, they're pissed off, and it's the conditions that they were put through. It's not knowing where they're going as an actor or just as a person in general. It's the perfect just pot full of ingredients.
Exactly. And you get moments like the mother who is like recounting the story, and she's holding her little boy, and she wasn't an actress. She was like a townsperson in Burkittsville, and he starts to freak out and starts screaming, "No!" and is trying to cover her mouth. And it's just like a perfect little moment. Like, it's just one of those things that if you were to script that moment, I don't think it would come off nearly as well. It would look fake. This doesn't look fake.
Can I jump in just a second here?
Go for it.
Yep.
Because it's funny, because I know we're going to touch on the legacy towards the end of the episode, but it was actually a little girl, and her mom and the girl are sort of very involved in the tour that goes on every October, the Blair Witch Experience.
Oh, wow.
And they're like really friends with the crew that organizes the tour, and they talk to the people that go on the tour and talk about their experience, and you know, they recreate the scene. And obviously the girl is now in like her 20s. So
does the mom still pick her up and hold her like that, or
they put her like usually there is like a little bit of a wall, and she sits on the wall so that she's still higher than her mom, and they play with the thing. Like, it's fantastic. Like you guys, God. Yes, it's absolutely great. And the townspeople are still like, whenever they go and clean up the cemetery, some of the fans go and clean up the cemetery with them. And it's just it really kind of outgrew the film, that community. So I'm really excited to talk about that later on.
That's very.
I feel like our podcast and the Weird Geeks podcast should like have a joint road trip to experience this and like live stream it or document it. You know,
I would totally be down for this. I might not be able to do it in 2019, but I think 2020 I'd be able to for sure. Because I definitely want to take a road trip down to Burkittsville and just see some of these sites. I think that would be so much fun. I think that would be. I wonder if I would just scare the hell out of myself doing it, but that would be a blast. What do we think? You know, I mentioned like the contradictory bits of info. The two fishermen. Oh, and what the woman also says when they ask, like, well, do you believe in the Blair Witch? And the mom says, I believe enough not to go in those woods. And I think that's such a perfect line and a perfect encapsulation of how folklore, how old wives' tales, how campfire stories can act on the imagination and scare you without even knowing you're being scared.
Well, we get scared with these kind of like myths and folklore tales. We get scared so much by them that they become real to us. We're in the, if you're in the woods and you hear all these things, you're gonna see something even if it's not there, because they're so ingrained in your psyche that it's impossible not to be frightened by these stories. It's impossible. I'm pushing 40 at this point, and the things that scared me when I was 12 still scare me because that's all I know. It's real in your head.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like you still, like, there are times where I'll go into a basement and that scared little boy from like when I was 10, 11, 12 years old that didn't want to go into the dark still wonders if there's going to be something down there. As ridiculous as that is when I'm in my 40s.
No, what's funny is, I don't even think I've told my wife this because I feel like she would make fun of me, and she probably will because she's next to me. So if you hear her laugh, that's what it is.
Oh, she'll never know. She'll never know.
Oh yeah, right. When I was a kid, I always had this thing in my head that like Michael Myers or someone would be behind me when I run upstairs. So I never walk upstairs my entire life. Last night, I think my wife asked me to get something for her, something like that. And I went downstairs and I realized, still 38 years old, I run up the stairs every time because I think somebody's going to get me. Like, these things never go away. I don't walk up my stairs at my house. I have to run.
We usually keep our doors unlocked here. We're in a really quiet little farm town, and our back door is usually unlocked. And there was a night about a couple weeks ago where my wife and I watched, I think it was a couple episodes of Mindhunter together. I'm rewatching the first season with her so she can catch up on it. And after it was over, I went downstairs to get like a drink or something. And it was about bedtime, and I'm like, you know what? I am going to lock the back sliding door tonight, and I'm also going to put in the little bar that prevents it from the lock being broken. You still, and I'm like 44 years old, and I'm like, nope, not doing this tonight.
These things get in your head, and it's impossible. Like, my son yesterday was like, Dad, Jason is in our backyard. And I know he wasn't, but, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say I ran to the window to make sure.
Right.
And I think, again, people might think we're getting off track, but all of this goes back to the Blair Witch Project and how effective it is. Yeah. We don't see shit in this movie.
Yeah.
But you feel like you do. Your psyche feels like you do, because we fill in the blanks. And there is not a single movie that is as successful with doing that to its audience as this film is.
Yeah, and part of it is, another pair of characters that work really well in the movie are those two fishermen right before the trio kind of goes off into the woods for the last time, because one of them believes, like, you damn fool kids are going to go get yourself killed, and then the other one is like, you're full of shit, like, you don't know what you're talking about. So I think a lesser movie, or a movie that wasn't as confident in itself, what it would do is say, nope, 100% everybody believes the Blair Witch is real, don't go in there, you're screwed if you do. What the Blair Witch does is, for every single person that believes in the myth, there's an equal and opposite reaction to someone who thinks this is all a bunch of hogwash and things that your grandmother would tell you to get you to go to bed at night and not act like a damn fool kid.
And you know what that is? That is fucking amazing filmmaking right there. Because what that is making the viewer feel like, you know what, it's probably not true. I'm living vicariously through this film, but at the same time, there are a good amount of people that don't believe the myth inside the movie, so I'm safe. And that is the best way to get under your skin little by little and scare the hell out of you, is making you feel like you're safe. But the moment you hear something, you're like, shit, I'm not. Like, it's perfect.
Exactly.
I really have nothing to add. You guys are extremely eloquent, and I'm kind of a bumbling mess just because I love this movie so much. But
You
going
not a complete mess at all. You have added so much insight to this movie already.
Absolutely.
Like, it's great.
well, I appreciate that, but I still think that my proficiency could do with some dusting off. But that's a topic for another podcast. In terms of the fisherman, to me, the fact that it's the last sort of main contact they have with people before they go into the woods, and they are divided. So you go into the woods with the trio divided yourself, as you mentioned. So you don't really know if they're gonna find something or not. Obviously, because it's called the Blair Witch Project, something which is happening, but you don't know if it's real or not. So even really late into the film, because this is a few good 20-30 minutes into it, you're still on the fence. Okay, well, is it real or isn't real? This whole thing that's happening, like, what's going on? And as you mentioned, this duality of belief is much more realistic than the absolute truth of whether this thing exists or not. And I would posit that the film it's not like the film works despite not showing anything. The film works because it doesn't show anything.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a very important distinction to make, because even films that came later, like much later, like Cloverfield, I think Cloverfield, despite some really annoying characters, it works because it doesn't show that much. And that leaving stuff to the imagination in an age where trailers give away the whole plot of the film, I think that's a little bit of a lost art that I wish we could get back.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. And one of the biggest reasons that a lot of people didn't like Godzilla that came out a few years ago, not the newest one, but the one right before that, is because it didn't show Godzilla enough for them. And I think that's the reason why I loved that Godzilla. I want to have some
100% on board with that.
Like, and I think films that are confident enough to be like, you know what? We're not going to put everything in the viewer's eyes. Let them fill in the blanks until they get it. And, you know, even sometimes we don't get it. With Blair Witch, I mean, we don't see it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's the magic of the film. And like you said, it's not despite not showing anything. It's the fact that they made the decision not to. And I think it makes it perfect.
It's not just that, too. It's not that just you don't see anything. It's that the characters don't see anything. And what this movie does, because it allows its actors to film everything, Blair Witch Project does something that's really smart, and maybe maybe I don't know if they were completely aware of their intention when they did this, or the effect that it would have. We've seen a lot of horror movies from the point of view of the killer. Obviously, you have Peeping Tom being the first instance of this. You have the opening shot of Halloween from the point of view of Michael Myers. And you have the shocking revelation that it's a 6-year-old boy that's responsible for this pretty brutal murder. The first couple Friday the 13th movies are largely told from the perspective of the killers. And also any Giallo film, you often get these POV shots of the killer. It puts the audience in their shoes. And in some ways, it allows the audience to root for these people because we see ourselves through their perspective. This is a movie you're seeing from the perspective of the victims. Everything is told in the perspective of Heather, Josh, and Michael. Except for like 15 seconds at the beginning when Heather is filmed in her own apartment right before she leaves and her friend is filming her. Other than that, it's completely of their perspective overall. So not only do you have that, you feel their fear when Michael and Joshua are screaming at Heather. They're screaming right at you, the audience. When Michael starts to break down, or Joshua starts to break down when he's filming, you as an audience member begin to break down. You're getting berated as an audience member. You're getting put through the paces with them. You're getting worn down by proxy. It becomes impossible not to feel empathy for them if you have any degree of empathy as a person at all. And that to me is a completely different way of doing a horror movie compared to point of view from the killer's perspective. So So it's a large part of why this movie works so well.
Well, that, and I mean, growing up, there were characters in horror films that I identified with so much. You know, I think that Laurie Strode from Halloween will always be a character that I just feel that is who I was growing up. But with that being said, a film like Blair Witch, and especially the Blair Witch Project, you're not only living vicariously through these characters because of their journey, but you are experiencing exactly what they're experiencing. Like you said, you feel what they feel when they're yelling at you. You know, you're holding the camera basically. Yeah. You feel like you're being yelled at. It's an experience of, it's not, like I said, it's not just living vicariously through your characters, is experiencing the journey of the characters with them, and it's so fucking unique.
Absolutely.
Exactly, and that's when we started the podcast episode, I was talking about the immediacy between what goes on the screen and the audience, and that's exactly what I was talking about. You completely feel like you are part of the film, and not only Heather, because she's a sort of the main camera person actually, even though Josh has the 16mm. You see most of it through Heather's video camera. But you feel almost like you are the fourth member of the crew. And to me, the removal of that barrier, that fourth wall in a way that, I hadn't really seen before, not by winking at the camera, but, through sharing the experience, not as an observer, but as a victim of what's going on. To me, that is the hallmark of why this movie works well and continues to have a huge impact on the way I do things and the way I feel about films.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to me, it's a little, I know that part of the reason found footage found such an audience in the decade after this movie, I think as technology became cheaper to get and easier to use, you could, to some degree, replicate what you saw here, but I don't think it's ever been done as effectively as it was used here.
Well, it's because, found footage is one of my least favorite subgenres, but I feel like only because I think Blair Witch did it so well that a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. But when you have films in the subgenre of found footage that work, it's because they make you feel like filming it is warranted. You know what I mean? I can never get on board with movies that it's just like a killer's chasing you with a knife, but you're still turning around filming him. You know what I mean? Like it takes me out of it. But the Blair Witch Project, you're there with them. Or certain segments, not the films as a whole, but for certain segments in the VHS film series work for me because it feels warranted. Like the kids, Jason Eisner's entry into VHS, the second one, with the kids having a sleepover and the aliens come, like the kids have a GoPro on the dog, like these are things that, like, okay, I understand why it's still filming. A dog's not going to stop to take the camera off of him. You know what I mean? Like, or the bicycle people in the second VHS where the zombies are coming after them, the GoPro's
right on
their
helmet.
Head. Yeah. See, that makes sense to me. And I think that is when it works. Whereas the Blair Witch Project, 100% of it works because they're also documenting it not only to make the documentary, but they're also documenting it because in a lot of ways you can tell they don't think they're going to get out of there. You know what I mean? Like, it makes sense to me.
And I think a lot of what makes most of the found footage films that fail is the fact that they believe that it is enough to make the found footage point of view thing happen from a technical point of view. And actually that's the easiest part of the whole thing, because you just turn on the camera and just point it at the actors with you behind it. So that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is making it believable that situation would be filmed and that there is a backstory to the situation, which is what created the lore of the Blair Witch Project. And to what you were saying, it works because of that. It works because there is a reason for this camera to be on, and you are given those reasons as soon as you jump into the film. And going back to Cloverfield, one of the things that to me don't really work about that film is the the reason why the filming continues and starts even, from the beginning of the film. And even the Paranormal Activity series, going back to it, it makes sense that people would want to film these strange things happening in their home, and it sort of sets up a world in which filming is not only allowed but makes sense. And I feel like the documentarian thing is a little bit played out by this point. So we gotta find, as an audience and as filmmakers, we gotta find a different way of making the camera valid as a character in found footage films. And I think that's where the fatigue is coming from, a lot of it at least, is the fact that people are not believing the reason behind why the camera is there. And I think that's why films that do work, like Creep, for example, which works beautifully. Great. It's because there's a reason for that camera to be there, and then you want the camera to be there because you want to know, like, what the fuck is this guy with the mask doing? Like, what's gonna happen? Is he for real? Is he nuts? There must be a reason for that camera to be the character in the film that it should be for a found footage film, and I think that's crucial.
Oh, definitely. And speaking on what you just said about Creep, that is definitely why that movie works. And that's what I was so reluctant and kind of somewhat skeptical when Creep 2 was announced, because I was like, well, how are they going to recapture that? But the idea of, it being a YouTube show of, the host needing something, so she's filming all these experiences, that works perfectly. And I think out of every found footage kind of franchise or series so far, I feel like the Creep movies are the closest to getting a kind of consistent vibe and tone and just being successful in doing exactly what we're talking about.
I completely agree. I can go with that 100%.
I would say that's very, very close to being true. I think maybe off the top of my head, and it's not quite a pure found footage movie, it's more documentary style, but the first Last Exorcism movie.
Great.
Yes.
I think that's one of the best examples of this genre in terms of being scary as hell. And it cheats a little bit, like there's music and whatnot, but I think that you can go through and fill in some blanks as to why. Like, I see that movie as a recruitment video. At the end of the day, like, that is shot as a recruitment video for the people that are responsible for the events of that movie at the end of the day. Like, that's why it looks like it does and sounds like it does at the end of that movie overall.
Well, I also think that a lot of filmmakers or studios think that its audience is the audience is kind of dumb at times. Like throwaway lines would make us be like, oh, that's why it's still filming. I like Cloverfield a lot just from like an entertainment perspective. But the thing that drives me nuts about Cloverfield is even another character asked TJ Miller's character why he's still filming, and he's like, this needs to be documented. It's like, no, it doesn't. There's a fucking monster chasing you. Throw the camera down.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
let someone else do that. Yeah.
It's like that movie. I like it, but it drives me nuts at the same time. I and I'm not going to obviously talk too much about Cloverfield, but I like it because it's not even a monster movie. It's a love story disguised as a monster movie.
Yes.
It works for me on that. But as far as like found footage kind of stuff, I think that, and I don't want to see a found footage movie where the footage looks like a J.J. Abrams movie, basically. You know what I mean? Like fuck, there's no way those guys had cameras that would look that great.
No.
I love that about Blair Witch. It looks grimy and gritty as hell, and that makes it even that more effective. It feels like something that I could have shot. And I don't mean that as a compliment to me. I mean that, like, it feels like something that we would be able to find, like, to get access to. And that makes it more relatable.
Well, in part you do that because you're not having the filmmakers aren't the ones that are filming the movie. So all of these, you're not having professional filmmakers record everything. Everything is left in the hands of Mike, Josh, and Heather. Josh and Heather in particular overall. And that's why you have that shakiness. That's why things aren't centered perfectly. You are getting what looks like the kind of footage, like you said, Jerry, that someone who's not a professional camera person is going to actually do.
That's also a big topic that people seem to bitch about when it came out. That it's shaky, that they're running around. Well, it's because Heather Donahue isn't a fucking professional camera person. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that's part of its charm.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree. And by the way, I have an inner ear disorder, so I'm dizzy the whole I've been dizzy since 2006,
Mm-hmm.
and Blair Witch Project does not make me sick. So, if you're watching something else, I've recently watched another found footage. I watch a lot of found footage, but I've recently watched another film that really did make me okay, this is getting a little twitchy.
It chapter 2?
No. Oh, please! I haven't seen that yet, so I can't comment on that. But there was, and it was recent too. It was a recent film, and it was twitchy as hell. And that one did make me sick. And I think filmmakers were kind of relying on movement to hide and to create that sense of wonder. But to me, it just didn't work. In the Blair Witch Project, it's accidental. It's because she doesn't know how to operate. Josh's footage is rock solid because he's the camera operator.
Right.
But Heather is just, filming just to have something to look back on. And it completely makes sense within the context of the film.
I Jerry, you had mentioned part of the reason found footage can fail sometimes is because there's not a pertinent reason to still be filming. And I think that part of the reason why this movie works so well is the reason that you're given makes sense and is a reasonable explanation. Why, and there are points where Joshua and Michael are begging Heather, please stop filming, put the camera away, stop doing this. And you can understand why they're doing that. And Heather's revelation and her this completely blistering honest moment when she says, it's all I have left. It's used as a coping mechanism. And as Josh says, it doesn't quite feel real when you're looking at it through this viewfinder. Its reality is just off enough where you feel like you're a character in a story, and characters in stories usually have happy endings. And I think that's a really wonderful and plausible explanation for why they filmed this whole movie.
Definitely.
That's a brilliant way of looking at it.
Every now and then I have a good idea. So what do we think of the scares in this movie? Let's talk a little bit about a few of the key moments overall. Because for people that say, nothing happens in this movie, true in a traditional sense, especially now when you're kind of conditioned for jump scares every few minutes or so, everything is more psychological here.
I think one of the reasons that the film hit me as hard as it did when I watched it is there is a lot of violation that happens within that movie. And that might sound weird, but if you're camping, or not even camping, there was a time a few years ago where I left my apartment. I lived by myself. I left my apartment to go somewhere. I came back, the door was open, and my stuff was everywhere. Mm-hmm. There is a sense of violation that happens when you feel like somebody has been in your area. Or if you go camping, you get up and there's stick figures all around where you are. Mm-hmm. Somebody has been there. That is scarier to me than any jump scares could ever be. Mm-hmm. It's that sense of your personal space just being violated. And I think that is one of the scariest moments in the film is where they find the stick figures. Mm-hmm. It's so fucking scary. I'm uncomfortable talking about it right now.
To me, the scariest scene is the one where the hands are on the tents.
Yeah.
Like they're filming from inside the tents and they could see hands, because that's so immediate. Like it's literally nylon between you and your perpetrator, and it's absolutely terrifying. Like you mentioned, I had something stolen from my yard a couple months ago, and my wife and I were like weirded out for weeks, because we thought, okay, if they came in to steal that, which isn't that valuable, like what the hell are they willing to do to steal our stuff that is worth something? Like what are they willing to do to fuck with our personal space and get away with it, you know? And when you put yourself in that situation, and let's get real, there are some really very nicely set up scares in the film, and I think the tent scene is one of them. I think the finger in the piece of shirt is another one. I think if you had that accompanied in a narrative way with John Williams' score behind it, people would not complain that wasn't scary. It's just because it's not scary in the traditional narrative way that we're used to seeing it in film, that people do not respond the same way. But to me, that's terrifying. Like if I woke up and found a finger in front of my house tomorrow, like I would get freaked out.
Yeah. So, and I think, Jerry, like you said, let's talk about those stick figures a minute. And I think part of the reason that's so effective is not just because you're finding stick figures, but the sheer volume and sheer randomness of when you're walking in, and it's a virtual forest of these things. So it's either one of two things. A whole group of people is hunting you down, because you would need a lot of people to do that in such a short time, or there's some supernatural explanation. And either way, you're going to be completely
you're
unnerved.
hopeless.
Yes. That's a great word.
Let's give a shout out again to Ben Rock, who designed the stick figure. Because I was actually there's a Facebook group for fans of the Blair Witch Project, and all of the filmmakers are in it, so it's an absolute hoot. And we were talking about the stick figures recently, and while Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick had the idea of having some sort of humanesque figure, the actual design was done by Ben Rock. And it's so, I don't know, it's perennially cool. Like, it's so simple and so effective. And it looks like you're on a cross.
Great.
Yeah.
It looks great. Like, it's one of the most, I think that design is one of the most underrated, like, sigils or images in horror. You know, like, it's so iconic to me. Like, if you see that anywhere, you know exactly what you're looking at. And I think I don't think people talk enough about how great that is. You know, we have so many people talking about, I don't know, like the Curse of Thorn symbol in Halloween, you know? Like Halloween 6. Halloween 6 gets so many people talking about that image. But, like, how often do you hear people talk about how iconic the stick figure is?
No.
And let's remember that it's an original design. It's not like a pentagram that you can just slap on something and call it a witchy thing. Like, this was something that eventually became part of the campaign and like the marketing side of things. And even recently, when the last video game released, a couple of it was announced, I think it was Gamescom. No, it was before that. Well, it was announced during a Games conference, and as soon as that symbol, because it was shown first before the title of the thing, you knew that this was a Blair Witch game. And nobody was expecting it, because it was 20 years after this thing was relevant. But there was the stick figure, and you knew, okay, shit, we're going back into the woods. And it's an amazing piece of design.
It's definitely it's one of the more iconic horror designs, and similar to in 2016 when the Blair Witch came out, and it was originally thought to be called The Woods. When it was revealed, nope, this is actually a secret sequel to the Blair Witch Project. They brought together like the posters, and it formed like a clearing in the trees that formed that symbol. It's like, oh, and as soon as you see that, you're like,
cool?
Oh shit. Yeah.
What's cool about that whole experience is they marketed it as The Woods, an upcoming movie. You know, at Comic-Con, we're going to have a screening of The Woods. Nobody knew it was Blair Witch. While the people were in the theater, they changed all the designs and the posters outside of the theater to finally reveal that it was Blair Witch to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is awesome. And the only thing that lost that experience a little bit to me is a friend of mine is an actor and was involved in some Adam Wingard movies.
Mm-hmm.
And this friend of mine told me a couple months before the reveal, it's like, hey, you know that's a Blair Witch sequel, right? And I was like,
dude,
God
don't
damn it.
do that to me.
Wow.
God
I
damn
don't
it.
want to know that. Yeah.
No, it's
Unfriended.
no, like it's you know, he's a great person, so I have nothing but respect. And I almost laughed at like, oh my God, I can't believe that. You know, because I think what happened was, if I remember correctly, what happened was I kept telling this friend how much the movie and the marketing reminded me of Blair Witch, and it was kind of like not upsetting me, but I was just like, are we getting a Blair Witch ripoff? What's going on? And he's like, well, Jerry, you know that's a Blair Witch sequel, right? And I was like, God damn it. So it wasn't like a, hey, I'm spoiling it. It was like, okay, they're not ripping off the Blair Witch. They're making one. So chill.
All right, so other scares in this movie. All right, let's talk about that tent scene. So I think part of what works too, like you have, like what if they ran, because again, they don't really have any direction. What if they ran towards the noises? You know, and you saw the people hitting it with their hands, like part of just happy accidents. The fact that Heather like looks at and says, "What the fuck is that?" But you never see what's out there. So I believe what it was is one of their friends or production assistants dressed in all white, just looking kind of creepy and shady, hanging out just out of line of camera overall. But then your mind fills in the blanks. Like they don't return to their tent, so you know they're sitting out there in the dark, in the cold for a few hours, being hunted down. And your mind just starts going in all these weird directions. Like that's part of the reason why that scene is works so well. Part of it is that visceral feeling of like you said, hands pressing on that really thin piece of nylon that separates you. And anyone who's seen a Friday the 13th movie and has seen Jason cut through those tents knows there's no real protection there. And then the other part of it is the thought of them, hey, my wife was outside walking the dog. Anyway, part of that is just knowing that they're out there alone.
What's scary about that is even from one hand on the tent, whether it was somebody just fucking with them or it was the real, supernatural elements, after you, as a camper or a person in general, after you see someone's hands on the other side, you will not sleep that night. It is guaranteed. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like that fear sets in and you start thinking the worst thoughts possible. And I feel like it is such good filmmaking. And I think that maybe that isn't even appreciated as much as it should. Because, the Blair Witch ended up being this big horror cultural zeitgeist. And, the most successful independent film of all time, it dethroned Halloween for that. Mm-hmm. So, we think about it as that. And we think about pop culture and we think of Blair Witch, how we all thought it was real and that kind of stuff. But I feel like as horror fans, a lot of us don't give Sanchez and Myrick and, like Marcos was saying, Ben Rock, enough credit for building that mythology and just even from a filmmaking perspective, those things are so successful in creating fear that it beats any jump scare, any day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
I 100% agree.
I cannot agree more. Absolutely. It makes part of too, like it gets to the end of the movie when they're running through that cabin and you see and we'll talk more in depth about this in a moment, but all of those little handprints on the wall. Mm-hmm. And you realize kind of where you are at that point. And it's a movie that can scare you, even if you're paying a little bit of attention to what's going on. But if you're paying attention to all the details and everything that came before it, that experience becomes so much more rewarding and so much scarier for the viewer overall. But it's also a movie that can, I think, Jerry, you said before there was a sense of hopelessness. The the moment where they circle back around after 15 hours of hiking in the woods, and part of the thing is like, you forgive a lot in this movie because there are moments where if you're kind of looking around at the surroundings, this is not a very densely populated set of woods. Like, there are clearings here and there that you can make out. You can hear airplanes traveling overhead as they're hiking. That's just part of the nature of it. But when they circle back around on that log, and there's no way they should have, just seeing this uprooted tree becomes a very viscerally scary moment, because you feel that sense of hopelessness and being how any thought of them getting out is really snuffed out at that moment. They've gone from being lost to being trapped.
Well, it's a combination of two things, in my opinion, and both utilize the hopelessness of it. The first one is you don't think they're going to get out. You, as an audience member, you feel hopeless too. You know this will not work out well. But the other flip side to it, and I might be the only person in history that has compared these two films together, the Blair Witch Project, to me, watching it, reminds me of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the sense that if they did get out, that tagline for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who will survive and what will be left of them. They're not getting out of that one way or the other. They're either not getting out because they're going to die, or they're not getting out because they will never, ever escape what is being left with them if they do get out. You know what I mean?
Excellent.
It works so well with, like I said, that hopelessness.
And I think that's a brilliant point, and I think that's something that they really wanted to emphasize. And we can see that intention in the Burkittsville 7, because that's exactly sort of what eventually happened in that side story. What happened to people who were subjected to this, not directly the same situation, but exposed to sort of this horror radiation thing that was happening in Burkittsville. And it is something that works, like you said, so well in the hope, in creating this sense of hopelessness that you just know that you're never going to be the same again. And again, because you're part of the film, because there's so much intimacy between you and the actors, you just feel like in your gut that something is not right, and that is it was never going to be right again.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So brilliant.
Part of it, too, I think, is that Heather Donahue, Josh Leonard, and Michael Williams do such an incredible job of interacting with one another. They're not only acting, but like you said, Jerry, reacting to one another, where you feel that camaraderie early on, but Heather always feels like a little bit outside, and she always feels like she has something to prove to the other two, where they never completely buy in to what she is trying to do here, and they're almost like humoring her, and you can feel her really pushing and really trying overall. And then that moment where Michael says, "I kick that fucking map into the creek," overall, and then the way like Heather just cracks at that point. And Joshua just, from that point on, almost checks out of the movie. His mind just snaps overall. And it's just fascinating to watch these characters break down psychologically.
And it's such a tour de force from an acting perspective, considering they had very little interaction before shooting started. So it's incredible to me, and I see that we have some notes about what became of the actors after the film. It's incredible to me that they didn't shoot up and become international superstars, because the amount of raw talent and acting ability that was required for those characters to come to life, I don't think it could have been pulled off by just anybody. And go ahead.
I agree 100%. I wasn't surprised when Joshua Leonard went on to have a very good career. I interviewed him a few years ago when The Town That Dreaded Sundown came out, and it was like a dream come true. You know, it was talking to Josh from the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
And like I've followed his career since then, and he's such a good actor. You know, Heather's kind of doing the marijuana thing now, which is great. I mean, her book is really good. I enjoy it.
Well, I will definitely talk about what became of her a bit, and like the pressures and real unfair treatment that she kind of received following this movie. I definitely want to talk about that when we talk about the legacy of this movie.
Yeah, let's do that.
So, I really like, the more and more I watch this, I really like Mike in this movie overall, because his character really shifts. He, like Heather calls him Little Mike. I'm really pleasantly surprised by Little Mikey, which is so insulting. Every time I hear that, I cringe. And I'm like, all right, maybe you deserve a little bit of the criticism you get, Heather, because that's kind of that's a really weird thing to say. He goes from being very antagonistic early on, and being the one who's like, I just want to go home. This is bullshit. Let's get out of here. And he really presses to being the person that tries to keep the group together, and maybe part of that is overcompensating for the fact that he's the one that kicked the map in the lake, but really that map was as useless as fucking used toilet paper. Let's be really honest with one another.
That, not only just useless, but how many times in life, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, have we done stupid little things like that, and then as soon as we do it, we're like, oh no. You know, it's happened to me so many times. I would have kicked the map out of frustration, and then afterwards, I'm like, I would have been like, "Oh no, what did I do?" and kept it to myself. Yeah. I feel like he was frustrated, but also it was kind of like a thing of accidentally just doing something out of anger and just instantly saying like, "Shit, what have I done?"
Actually, if I can interrupt with another little bit of my shitty nobody cares trivia.
No,
the actual map that they had was useless.
Really?
Yeah.
So it was a frustrated.
Yeah, it had no useful information whatsoever on it. And it was given to them by Ben, and they were talking about it just recently, publicly on the group, and he said, for the record, just to clear Mike's name, that map was fucking useless, as just like you said, it was useless as toilet paper. So, there was something to Mike kicking it into the river after all, because it just wasn't going to help them from the get-go.
God, that is great.
But not only that, if you're off trail hiking and you don't even know where you are, there's really not, because when you can kind of see a little bit of the map, there's not much there that would tell you where you are. I kind of find it funny when Josh is he tries to play alpha male, and it's just dirty fucking hippie. You're like, oh, just Josh is the kind of dude I would when Jerry Garcia died, my sister and I were driving around and we saw a bunch of deadheads, and we're like, Jerry's fucking dead, because we were assholes back then. Just this dirty hippie trying to be alpha male, well, let me look at the map, I'll tell you where we are. Josh, fuck you, dude, you don't know you know
look at the map. I think that's why I like the character of Josh so much, is because in a lot of ways I'm a lot like that character. If something was wrong, I would be the person to be like, well, let me look at it, having never looked at a map in my life.
Yeah,
exactly.
Me too. That'd be fucking me, 100%. Yeah. And I think it's funny because you latched on to a character. Whenever you watch the film, you if you really connect with it, you are either Josh, Heather, or Mike. And for me, I was also Josh. I wanted to be the voice of reason, and who the fuck is she to tell me where to go, and stop fucking filming. I have the camera. I'm boss.
Well, but Josh also had that really great mix. Yeah. he really had that great musical mix. So
it did become a bestseller. So you gotta give him he's a regular time on Powell.
So, but I love when he's if I have to yell at you again, and he just gives her the finger, and at the point where he's you kind of know that he's a doofus when he's like looking at the camera going, oh yeah, we're going to do it in meters. He's like, well, we don't use meters. We use feet. He's like, yeah, but this camera has meters on it. She's like, well, what about the ones over there? Well, those are feet. It's like, have you used this camera? Well, maybe once. Just kind of like, he's just a doofus. And he's
Works
the one.
so well.
And he's the one that he just disconnects from them very quickly. And Mike actually recognizes that before Heather does, where he's like, give him a minute. When he's like lying out in the woods on his own, like, give him a minute. He's not all there at this point. And you almost, there's one of the readings of this movie is that it's Josh at the end. That Josh is actually snapped and he's the one that lures them in and he's the one that kills them, and who knows. I don't buy into that reading, but I can understand why people do. He's also, and I think we'll talk about this more when we talk about the treatment of Heather, he is needlessly cruel to Heather in that scene where he's pointing the camera at her and he's like, you're lost in the woods, you're hungry, you're alone, what do you do? And she starts breaking down and crying. And what really makes that scene, punctuates the cruelty of that, is he stops talking, it's quiet for a few moments. He's like, are you going to write us a happy ending, Heather? And she just runs off in tears. Like, he's cruel in that moment. And it's like, that's when you're kind of like, how fucked they are, because they can no longer function as a unit.
No, they completely turn on each other, and it's such an interesting arc to watch, because they start out like very pretty stoked on the whole experience,
together, they're making jokes in the supermarket,
well, hey Mike, welcome aboard kind of thing, and all this stuff. And by the end of the movie, they're so fractured. And speaking on the thing where Josh has just kind of lost it. There have been so many times in my life where you're facing these just insanely difficult things in your life, to where you get to the point where you're like, I don't know how to feel anymore. Whether it's good, it's not good, it's not bad. It's just almost like a nothingness. And that's what it reminds me of every single time I watch this movie. I don't feel like he snapped to the point where it's Josh that did it. Not at all. I've never bought that. I feel like he's just to the point where it's just so hopeless that he's just like, I can't fulfill anything right now. It's interesting.
To me, the reason why that scene with Josh and Heather work so well is because I don't know about you guys, but I can personally see myself being that much of an asshole to her if I was in that situation. And it's not because I'm an asshole naturally, but because I know the situation is that dire that it would turn me into the shittiest version of myself towards somebody who, I was previously very friendly with. And maybe that's just me being a secret asshole. But the truth is that being in a very shitty situation can turn a good person into a shitty person really quickly. And obviously there are some bounds and some caveats to that, but you cannot really judge Josh as a person based on how he acts in a situation of extreme hardship.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I think as human beings, we've all been there, without going into detail, obviously, like my wife and I went through some stuff a few months ago. And it brought out, I think, the absolute worst in us, because we didn't know how to react to that. It wasn't that either of us were angry at each other or mad at each other for anything. It's just the situation was so just hopeless feeling that, you're not in control of kind of what you say or you react, because you're so trying so desperately to fix it, or in your own head, you're trying to fix it. Josh is trying to fix it in his own head. How do we get out of this, while feeling like we're never going to get out of this? Yeah. I don't judge Josh whatsoever. I think watching that movie, I think it's a good film that maybe doesn't get enough credit for being a really good character study of what would happen when you're lost. You know?
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So Marcos, you might be able to speak on this a little bit. My understanding is that initially it was going to be Mike that was going to disappear, and that Heather and Josh got to the point where they were sniping so much during the filming that an audible was called, and it was going to be and Josh is the one they had disappear on day 6 out of 8 or 5 out of 7.
I have no information other than that. I have no true like insider's knowledge. However, it was noted in the material that I was researching for a piece I did recently on the Blair Witch Project and on Eduardo Sanchez in particular, that they were real sparks. There was some acting and then some very real interaction between Josh and Heather. As to whether that influenced the way it was shot in the end, I don't know. But definitely, like, a lot of the reactions were real, like we mentioned, and that's the reason why the filming works. But I have no idea whether Mike was supposed to disappear or not.
That's my understanding of it. And you can see a little bit of that antagonism from the first moment when Josh shows up and she's like, oh, it's Mr. Punctuality. Like, he's already late and she's already pissed off, and they're already kind of sniping a little bit from the first moment they interact. And it only goes downhill from there. After a brief peak early on, as soon as things looked a little bit dire, like, they really go at it. And when he disappears, I think you see Heather and Mike bond in a really real way. I don't think that you would get the raw emotional realness of Heather's confessional at the end if Josh had still been part of the picture. I think that having those 2 days without him there, and without her and Michael don't snipe. Her and Michael really try to work with one another and comfort one another. There's that moment where the camera just shows them with their arms around one another, and it's not sexual, which is another thing I think this film should get credit for.
Oh, yes.
There's no sexualization of Heather. There's no sexual tension. There's no, like, we're going to fight over this woman at all. It's they all interact as peers with one another. And I think that if Josh had still been part of the picture, you may not have gotten that realness, that kind of raw emotion from Heather at the end. Because I would have been like, fuck this dude. Let him, whatever happens, happens.
Another thing that I feel is so just effective and successful in that whole sequence is it's basically became a meme before memes were a thing, with Heather's confessional. Every parody movie tried to, knock it off as a joke. There's TV shows that were kind of like poking fun at her confessional thing. But what that moment is to me is the realization, because Josh has been gone for a couple days, the realization of this is the moment where I realize that not only can something really happen to us, but that something is going to happen to us.
I just want to apologize to Mike's mom and Josh's mom and my mom. And I'm sorry to everyone. I was very naive. I am so sorry for everything that has happened. Because in spite of what Mike says now, it is my fault. Because it was my project. And I insisted. I insisted on everything. I insisted that we weren't lost. I insisted that we keep going. I insisted that we walk south. Everything had to be my way. And this is where we've ended up. And it's all because of me that we're here now. Hungry and cold and hunted. I love you, Mom. And Dad. I'm so sorry. close my eyes. I'm scared to open them.
She uses the word hunted. We're out here, we're cold, we're tired, we're hungry, we're being hunted.
She knows that this is the end. And I think, though that moment became kind of a joke to a lot of people, I think it's one of the most effective scenes in horror films in history.
I completely agree.
Yeah, I think it's so honest and real that it's hard not to feel your heartstrings just being tugged out.
I completely agree. And I think it's from an acting standpoint, it's so underrated. Just because it became a meme afterwards, and people focus on this, like on the snot and stuff. It's not like they placed it there in post production. That was real. Nope. Like she was for real breaking down. And it takes a special kind of fucked up to get an actor to go to that place. And I think, and a special kind of actor to react in the way that she did. Yeah. And it really sort of brings home, as you mentioned, Jerry, the whole situation that it is an inescapable situation that sadly we're probably not gonna get out of.
And I think, too, like, it's a happy accident that the camera is so close up on her face from the nose up. I believe she thought she had herself in pretty good frame. And my understanding is when they first received that footage, the directors were like, are we going to have to do this over? And I think they were smart enough to realize, like, no, this is what works. Like, this is what really works. And it's so having that just put in so tight, and I think part of the reason why this scene is parodied so mercilessly, or was at that time, is because it's so effective, because it makes you so uncomfortable as an audience member to confront that amount of real emotion and raw emotion in a scene. Your reaction is going to be, this is too real, therefore I have to poke fun at it, to put distance from it, to make myself feel comfortable.
Well, I feel like in films that deal with kind of a hopeless wrap up at the end, I feel like there's three different ways you could approach it that we see. There's one where things get hopeless, but hey, I got a machine gun, I'm going to get out of it. And that's something I find infinitely difficult to get on board with. Then there's like John Carpenter's The Thing, where Kurt Russell and Keith David, they know that one of them is the Thing. They know that whoever isn't the Thing knows that I'm not going to get out of this. So they just sit there and they drink together. And that's the end. It's kind of like giving up, but kind of being like, well, that's it. And then there's Heather, who just breaks down. And that is the kind of film that, as a filmmaker, I just aspire to make, something with honesty. And I feel like that's another thing that Blair Witch Project doesn't get enough credit for. It's such an honest look at the way that we deal with things. Take the witch out of it. Take the supernatural elements out of it. We get a character study. And you know what? I finally found a way to work into my final chapter thing I say on every episode. I always say that if you take Jason out of the final chapter, it's still a great coming-of-age movie. Well, guess what, guys? I got a new one. If you take the Blair Witch out of the Blair Witch Project, you got a great character study. That is my new one. I'm sticking to it.
You're going to work that in
awesome.
on every episode we ever do. So I want to talk a little bit about the last scene of the movie. I want to talk a bit about finding Rustin Parr's cabin and how effective that is as a closing scene, because that still scares the hell out of me to this day.
Well, yeah, I think it's one of the scariest endings around. And plus, like, it's an interesting idea, going back to what Parr said, the ghost of the witch told him to do it. It's kind of interesting that that's kind of where it leads to, That's another reason why I don't feel like Josh did it. I've never liked that theory. I think Parr was right. I do think it's the Blair Witch, and I think that's a little easier to get on board with.
Just as a point of interest, again, the filmmakers have recently talked about the theory about Josh, and also about the theory about both of them, both Josh and Mike, luring Heather into the woods. The witch is real, basically. So from the horse's mouth, so to speak, the witch is very much real. For me, it works on a number of levels, not least because it almost feels like it's stuck in another place in time, and that's explored further in the third film. The whole idea of this endless time loop sort of thing, and out of place timelines kind of thing, and I think the brilliant thing about Rustin Parr's house is that it brings together the whole backstory of where we started back into front and center. Throughout the sort of middle section of the film, we were left with most of the action, so to speak. The interaction between the characters and the lore is left behind. But by the end, when we get to Rustin Parr's house, everything is brought back into sharp relief. Like, this is real. This is happening. This is the house, and we don't know what's going to happen, but we know it's not going to be good. And to me, that's why it works. It's such a neat little bow on top of the story, and it works really, really well.
Part of why this scene works so good is what immediately came before it, where Heather discovers a little bundle that has Josh's tongue and some teeth in it. And what's funny about that scene is I think that's one of the times they had her go back and actually refilm, because when she first sees it, she's like, just throws, like, nope, not looking at this, and throws it to the side. And I think they had her like, no, you actually have to open this, and we need to see what's in there. So when she hears... you hear Josh screaming the night before it's found, and it's this gurgling sound, and it's almost inhuman, like he's being tortured. And then the next night, he's very clearly calling out, and there's folklore around witches, that witches will steal your tongue and teeth in order to mimic the victim's voice at that point. So that ties into kind of the folklore of witches and witchcraft and whatnot. But and even Heather says, like, this can't be real. Like, this cannot be happening right now. But at this point, you're 7 days in the woods. You stumble upon something that is not trees and logs and leaves and creeks, and they run to it. It's decrepit and as terrifying as that place looks from the outside. I wouldn't go into that thing for $1 million at that point, I think, as I say from the safety behind my microphone. The other reason that scene works so well is once Mike is knocked over the head and he has the DAT and he has that camera, you hear Heather screams, but she's holding the 16 millimeter camera that doesn't have any audio to it. So you hear her screaming Mike's name over and over again, but it's presented from a distance. It's Mike's Mike's DAT that is in the basement that is picking up those screams. Mm-hmm. And that's terrifying because it sounds, like you said, being out of place and out of time. Her screams feel so disconnected from what you're actually seeing on screen at that moment.
Not only that, but you feel that she's coming towards your microphone, right? She's coming towards that. So something happened to Mike, and that Heather is on her way to you. Mm-hmm. So it's absolutely terrifying because you want to say, Heather, stop. Don't come any nearer, and yet inevitably she comes, and then we have the famous scene where the camera is dropped. Just as a little fun fact, I love those. When you were mentioning that you wouldn't go into the house, actually, when Ben Rock, it seems like I'm sponsored by Ben Rock, but I swear I'm not. he was the one who got the children to paint the house, and he prepared the house for filming. And he said that there were a couple of days where he had to stay there at night, not overnight, but to work at night. And he was like properly terrified of being in that place, and that it was really, really scary, and it had a real vibe to it. So just thought I would throw that out there, that you were not alone. Even the makers of the film did not feel all that great about the location.
No, thank you. Not doing that.
Well, even though that he knew that it was fake because he created the mythology, I could, as an artist or a writer, when you create something, it kind of becomes real to you in a way. So being out there at night, knowing this whole mythology that he created it at the same time, it's a reference in his own head. Like, I can't imagine doing that. It's like, if I were asked to do that, I would have been like, well, guys, good luck on your movie. It was nice knowing you. I'm out.
Yeah, I'm out of here.
Like, no.
And then you have this moment of Heather discovering Mike standing in the corner, and if you've been paying attention, your mind immediately goes, oh shit, that's just like those kids from earlier in the movie, and that guy was killing them, and one was standing in the corner. And as you're processing that, something happens to her. She's hit, she's struck, she falls down, the camera hits the ground, and it has that perfect judder where it's just going out of focus, and it's like the frames are just kind of like popping in and out at that point, and then it ends, and it's just so rewarding of an ending. It's absolutely perfect. Marcos, why don't you speak a little bit about some of the endings that were refilmed for the movie when Artisan picked it up and wanted to see it reshot?
Sure. One of the things that Artisan was kind of iffy about was the lack of action in the ending, and the fact that you couldn't really see what happened to Mike. So a couple of the endings feature Mike more prominently. There was one where he's tied to the huge stick figure that they made. There was one that was like 8 feet tall or something. And basically they tied him to it. And when Heather comes into the basement, he's tied there and he's looking straight at her and stuff like that. But it didn't, in the end, I mean, they filmed it obviously after they got bought at Sundance. And it really just didn't feel like a satisfactory ending to a film that is mostly about the unseen danger. So it was really to bring into focus what the alternative endings tried to do was to bring into sharp focus what could have happened to Mike, specifically in terms of being either tied or cursed or disfigured, stuff like that. However, none of them ended up on the film, and Artisan decided to keep the original ending.
Yeah, and you can watch the alternate endings on the Blair Witch Special Edition DVD or Blu-ray, and they don't work nearly as effectively. The idea, like the one of like Mike being tied to the stick figure and kind of floating out there, it looks really goofy. Like when you actually see it in action, it's almost comical at that point. I think the idea of just like finding someone, like if you want to freak somebody out, if you're ever in a basement, just go stand in a corner and don't move. That's going to freak people out. And I think it's because of this. Like, it's just like, it's creepy and unnerving because it's such an unnatural thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what adds to the scariness of the Blair Witch Project overall. All right. So Marcos, I know you're a little pressed for time.
Yes, a little bit, not that much. Like I got another 5 minutes for you guys, just because I love you guys.
Okay, so why don't we talk a little bit? Where would you like to go? I wanted to talk a little bit about how this movie was marketed a bit. Let's talk about Sundance if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think personally, I think the marketing aspect of it, while absolutely brilliant, has somewhat overshadowed the brilliance of the film itself. So while a lot of people focus on that, it's not my favorite aspect of the whole thing, because it was brilliant at the time, but I think the film really stands out.
Mhm.
It stands up on its own 2 feet. So we can definitely touch on it, and I have a lot
Sure.
to say about about it all. So we can go wherever you guys want.
So I think
Well-
part of, like you said, the brilliance of the film working on its own is how unafraid Sanchez and Myrick were to hack the movie up. Because the original cut of the movie runs about 2.5 hours, and the bulk of that movie looks a lot more like Curse of the Blair Witch. And the last 30 or 40 minutes of the movie ends up being them lost in the woods. You end up getting the inverse of this, where 20 minutes is out of the woods, and it's all documentary, and the last hour of them is just walking into the woods at that point. So they have a lot of courage to take their original vision for the movie and say, nope, that's not working. Let's actually just stitch together 85 minutes of pure terror.
And I think that's why I'm so interested in you talking about the last broadcast as maybe as a catalyst for the cut, because it really was a pivotal moment in the history of this film that they decided to cut out the stuff that ended up, like the phase 2 stuff that ended up on the Curse of the Blair Witch, and decided to stick with the phase 1 into the woods footage, because that really sets the film apart. And as much as I love hybrid storytelling, I think it really works best as it is, and I think they realize that.
I think you first.
I was just going to say that I think that is one of the best things about the movie. I think if it was reversed, the way that it was originally intended, I don't think it would have worked as well. I think a big reason for me that it works so well is that it sets up this mythology for the first, 15, 20 minutes. And then you get to live out the experience of being afraid, being injected into that mythology and stuff. Whereas, if the most of it was getting you into knowing the mythology and then kind of putting you in the woods for a little bit, I don't think it would have been as frightening. I think it's very frightening, like I said, getting a little glimpse of the past, but then you get to go through it with the characters.
I completely agree. It's kind of like being in a roller coaster. Like, you stand in line for a little bit, and then you have sheer terror firsthand. So it's kind of that way. You set up the story, and then you jump into the cart, and away you go.
Yeah,
I agree, and I really like the fact that you get like 20 minutes of what the documentary would have looked like. Before you jump into it. So you get, and it's not easy to fake a documentary, but you get an idea of like Heather as a narrator slipping into like documentary mode. You get a feel for how it would have come off if they were to complete the whole picture. And I know there's that moment in Curse of the Blair Witch where one of her professors is like, Heather was my brightest student. She was a great pupil. She was really smart, passionate, driven. And he's like, if I had looked more closely at what this project was, I would not have signed off. So he takes a little bit of the blame, saying I wouldn't have signed off. He's like, I didn't realize how unscouted and the dangers that were involved of just kind of going into the woods in a project like this or a film shoot like this, because she was just that dedicated to crafting something. So I like that you get that 20 minutes of it.
See, that's in what, Curse of the Blair Witch, you said? See, that little scene would have been perfect, I think, in the actual film before they go in the woods. Because if you get that kind of cautionary, like, well, I wish I would have known that this would have been a really horrible idea, as a viewer, you're instantly thinking, oh God, what was it? What happened? Like, that's such a good touch. Like, I wish they would have kept that in the movie.
I think you get it without that, though, because going in, like, the posters, everything is saying, like, they were never found. So when you're going into this movie, you're not going into it saying, like, how are they going to get out? You're going into it going, like, how does it end up going wrong for them?
Yeah, I agree. I think the ambiguity in the storytelling really works in the film. I personally, the stuff that ended up on Curse of the Blair Witch, it is, to me, sort of the lowest quality footage that they got in terms of actual content, because it's sort of, how to explain it? it takes itself too seriously when it's really sort of playing on an idea that is a little phony. Whereas the actual film, there is no setup other than what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And you, when you're watching Curse of the Blair Witch, you can sort of tell that that's fake. But when you're watching the Blair Witch Project, like you have no inclination. Even Heather's documentary skills, like they're not that bad. Like that's the way I've seen documentaries from friends who went to film school. Like that's the way they shoot it.
Yeah.
So to me, the stuff that ended up being cut took away from the realism of the thing and kind of broke the suspension of disbelief, at least for me. And that's why I prefer that it's not there, because I like both the ambiguity of the storytelling in the main film and the fact that we don't get this cheesy news-like footage that I personally don't like as much.
So when this movie is picked up by Sundance, it's getting about an 80-minute cut that goes to Sundance. The actors aren't allowed to go, which that's a little bit heartbreaking because
it's a bummer.
It's but they're like, we need to keep up. Again, we're not telling people this is real, but we're also not going to tell people that it's not real. So
it's basically the Cannibal Holocaust situation again.
Kind of like that, exactly. Where it's like, we're just going to present it as is, and you're going to, as an audience member, you're going to be allowed to make up your mind. They go as far as to put up missing signs all over town with the actors' names and pictures on them. Although I guess they had to take them down because someone actually did go missing, and they're like, "Oop, this is in kind of bad taste." So it makes its midnight premiere, and this is really the first kind of genre film at Sundance that gets like this. Now it's become a tradition, and Blair Witch is what kicks that tradition off. It makes its premiere. The audience goes nuts for it. By 6 a.m. the next day, Artisan is like, here's a bunch of money. Here's $1 million. We would like to buy your movie. Please and thank you.
$1 million. Like, that as a filmmaker, especially an independent filmmaker, can you imagine Sanchez and Myrick like getting that offer? That's the moment that as a filmmaker and just as a person, that is the exact moment that they could probably pinpoint their lives changing. You know what I mean? It's such a great story to hear. Like I love hearing that.
Considering that they sunk anywhere from like 35 to 60,000 into making the movie, is what the original cost of it was. Now Artisan does give them more money. They give them 6 figures to reshoot a quote-unquote real ending like Marcos had talked about, although that is all that it's kind of money they set on fire. The original of the other ending that they had come up with, I believe, was like the Kool-Aid Man bursting through the basement screaming, "Oh yeah," at the end, which would have been fucking awesome if they had done that, but I had to.
Part of the money also went to improving massively, improving the sound.
Yes.
Which for me, as I mentioned before, my background is in sound, so to me it makes such a huge difference. I really cannot stress enough just how big of a difference it can make on the way it looks, a movie looks. When the sound is right, and like you mentioned, this realism of having the dad in the basement and Heather approaching, that's what sets up the final scene, and it really is an absolute masterpiece in terms of sound post-production, especially considering the source material that they had to work on. And just as a side shout out, if you're into sound and spatial accuracy and found footage, Ben Rock directed a podcast called Video Palace for Shudder, which you should absolutely check out because it is amazing. And they pay so much attention to sound sources and accuracy in terms of spatial reproduction. And it is a complete nerd fest for me as a sound geek, but also a brilliant piece of storytelling. So shout out to that. And
No, it's a fantastic podcast, and I'm really hoping we get it set up for a second season. I would love to hear more of it. So Shudder, do the right thing. I really enjoy that podcast a lot.
Absolutely.
So movies, he gets picked up by Artisan. They're going to go full. They're going to go full national with it. Aside from the Curse of the Blair Witch, the other piece of marketing that really helps this movie, they invest probably the first movie to really use the internet as a marketing tool, and not in a way where it's like, here's a trailer, here's some behind the scenes, here's what people are saying. It's, here is all the mythology of the movie laid bare. And you can, it's primitive by today's standards, but it includes video clips. It has a timeline of the mythology. There are photographs of the police investigation. And then
wasn't there like, I think you were about to say the same exact thing I was about.
Go ahead.
Like, there wasn't there like a made up history of how it happened?
Exactly. There's the history of like, here's the student archaeology team that found the videotapes. Here are the families like suing the police department and then eventually getting the footage released back to them. So it has all these like details that they don't quite need to have, but it allows. I said like 2 hours ago about buying into pro wrestling being real and suspending disbelief. That's kind of what this was like at the time, like finding this footage or believing it to be real. I had only heard about this movie 4 or 5 days before I went to see it with my best friend Joan. She told me about it and pointed me in the direction of the site. And I poured over it over the course of 2 days, and then got to see the movie when it like premiered in Boston as part of like 5 cities that got the movie 2 weeks before it went national. And I completely got sucked in by this website.
My dad told me that it was real.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason that I went to see it. Mm-hmm. I was 18 when it came out, when it went wide. And I hadn't heard a single thing about it before that, other than my dad picked me up from, I think I went to the mall or something, telling me that he heard on the news or something, people talking about this movie, that it was real, about these people that went missing looking for a witch. Yeah. And like, that's all it took for me to just hit the ground running. I looked up the website and everything else. And it kind of goes back to what Marcos was saying. Me personally, I think it's a double-edged sword. Because, the marketing was great, and it was a game changer as far as marketing. But when you think of the Blair Witch Project, 9 out of 10 people go back to that viral marketing instead of what I've kind of come to terms with just in this episode. I liked the movie before we started this episode. By this point, a couple hours into our conversation, I've realized it's one of the best films of all time.
It's one of my top 3 horror movies of all time, along with American Werewolf and The Thing.
Like, talking about it, every single element, I've realized that I feel like it's one of the best movies of all time. And I think that maybe that isn't what the focus is. It's kind of like what Marco said, like the focus is mostly on like the marketing and stuff, and it kind of takes away from the effect of the actual film. So, I mean, it's good.
Just as a side note, sorry to interrupt. Just as a side note, shout out to Daniel Karcher, who designed the website and maintains it to this day. You can still access the website, and it's regularly updated actually for like accuracy and some other stuff. And there are 2 sites, like the one that originally launched, and then there's another site that launched a little bit later, and both sites are live to this day. And you can still read all of this crap. Like, you can read for days. And it's still all online. I'm looking up the address right now just to give it out. But he designed the website. He built the website from the ground up, and it's incredible. 20 years later, he's still managing it today.
It's great.
Yeah,
I'm just looking up the address right now so that I can give it up. Well, it's BlairWitch.com. Isn't that easy?
Yeah, and we will definitely, I think, have links to that here in our show notes overall. Yeah. So this movie debuts in 5 cities like Boston, New York, LA, Chicago, and I don't remember what the other one is. But this movie hits 5 cities first and then goes national. And when it hits 5 cities, it makes like, it's tons of money per theater. And it's like back when the slow rollout could actually work pretty well. And then it just starts raking in millions of dollars. It becomes an event. It becomes a kind of movie that the initial audiences coming out of it tell people, you need to see this movie. You need to see this movie. And audiences flock to it. This is when the backlash hits on the movie. Mm-hmm. This is like people that were told about it as opposed to seeking it out are like, I didn't find it scary. Nothing happens. It made me want to throw up. The camera shakes too much, or like it's not as, and people like end up hating this movie for, despite the fact that it makes a shit ton of money. People walk out of it and hate the movie because they don't see anything. Now, my theory on this is when people realized it was a fictional movie and not a snuff film, they felt cheated. And they turn on the movie and the filmmakers. They feel like the wool has been pulled over their eyes at that point, and they don't like that.
Okay, but this is my theory on that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Key and Peele, that show.
I am.
There's a skit that came out. I think they did a newer one where they both come out of a horror movie, and they're the typical horror fans that talk about, oh no, it wasn't scary at all. Oh, no, it was nothing. While they're pissing their pants and, like, holding each other in their arms and stuff. Mm-hmm. I feel like that is 100% the Blair Witch detractors. That they were like, oh, well, this... Kind of like what happened with Paranormal Activity, which made the foolish decision of saying it's the scariest film of all time.
Never do that.
No, do not. The Evil Dead remake did that same thing. Yeah.
The scariest movie of all time is that bondage film of my grandparents. That's terrifying.
Right?
Hey, don't knock my collection. Don't knock it till you tried it, bro.
Right? No, but I feel like whenever a film gets hyped up to that, there's always going to be those people that's like, no, it didn't affect me at all. Meanwhile, they need a change of underwear because they shit their pants.
I think a lot of it just has to do with the sheer amount of people that saw it. So you're gonna get people who didn't like it. Even Citizen Kane has a ton of people to this day that find the movie boring and long and slow. So I think it was bound to have detractors from the moment they decided to make it different. People don't like different. So I think it was a natural reaction, and I think you hit on the point there about pulling the wool over their eyes. I think they did feel cheated. I think, and knowing from personal experience, when I found out that it wasn't real after watching it, I felt cheated too. But not to the point where I disliked the movie. Just I was disillusioned by the fact that this experience, this thing that I had discovered and that changed my life, wasn't really all it was cracked up to be. So I can understand why the people felt, why they felt a little cheated.
The thing that bothers me is the nothing happens thing that gets thrown around.
Yeah, like, I think that's a lot of that so for people who haven't seen it.
Well, and even like we still fight with horror fans these days with that, with like slow burn films and stuff like that. Like I remember going to The Witch. I saw The Witch at a festival before it came out, and there was a couple people like, I hated it, nothing happens. Or The Black Coat's Daughter, I hated it, nothing really happens till the end. It's part of storytelling, right? Building mood and tension.
It's part of like when you watch the Blair Witch in 2016, they go they try to mimic the path of the Blair Witch Project, but make it a roller coaster ride throughout the film, and it doesn't work. Like it doesn't take a moment to breathe, and it's part of my issue with the latest It movie, which it's good. I would go see it again at a drive-in with family, whatever, but it never takes its time to breathe. Like something has to happen every 30 seconds in a movie like this, or you feel like you're not doing anything, where this movie lets it build up this existential dread throughout it, and that's why it works. Like it's not meant to be a theme park ride. It's just meant to like make you feel unnerved and unsettled throughout the movie. So this
that's what scares me as a viewer. I'm not afraid of people popping up at me. I'm afraid of losing hope You know, that's my biggest fear.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think it plays a lot into what we're afraid of as people, like individually.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will not find, hopelessness scary because maybe they've never felt hopelessness before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At least to that degree or in that situation, it's not a trigger for them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it resonates with people who have had that feeling and who have felt hopeless, and you put yourself in that situation, and particularly with that level of intimacy between what goes on the screen and yourself, and you have a recipe to have perhaps less of a wider impact, but much more of a harder impact on the people you do connect with.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. And I think for the people that appreciate it, like I didn't watch this again for 10 years, not because it wasn't a great movie, but because like I don't know if I could go through this again. And when I did watch it again, I remember it was the night that Paranormal Activity was playing in Boston for the first time, and I'm like, I'll watch Blair Witch Project again. I'm gonna watch it like on an iPad though, because fuck that if I'm gonna like watch it on a big screen, And I've come to like. We've screened it outdoors in my backyard and to cover like almost kind of in the woods, and we would love to do like an outdoor screening of it in the woods that are near us, and I've tried to figure that out because it's still
I'm getting shivers. I'm getting shivers hearing about that. I saw it when I was 18, and I didn't watch it again until I was 36, 2 years ago. Like it's just it is.
Mm-hmm. So
for me, I try to revisit it at least once a year, and there are years like if something's fucked up in my life, whenever I try to rewatch it, I can't reach it. Like I can't go through like whenever that scene pops out where Josh snaps at Heather, that's usually where I like switch off. Because it gets way too real, way too fast, and I gotta check out because it hits all the right boxes at the wrong time.
So, whose fault is it? That's why maybe the last thing we chat about here before Marcos, you gotta go. Yeah. Whose fault is it that these kids are doomed?
I think personally. I think, and this is why I love the film so much on a personal level and why it inspired my own filmmaking career. I think it's discrimination. And I think it's because if there never was an indication that Ellie Kedward was an evil witch before she was brought out into the woods to die. Being a witch does not necessarily make you a bad person. It just means you are a pagan.
Right.
The difference in practicing of beliefs led these people to basically torture to death this woman. That, we do have some inkling regarding the kids and that kind of stuff disappearing, but it really starts to take off after she is left out to die into the woods. So for me, it really was something that was brought upon by this lack of tolerance that was shown towards Ellie Kedward. Perhaps maybe I'm just being a little, rose-tinted glasses type person. But I do think that it goes all the way back to Ellie Kedward and the reasoning why she was left to die. Because when you set that kind of thing in motion into the universe, even to this day, personally, I think that when you create something like that, you put something like that out into the world, that level of evil, against a person, I think that it will continue to haunt you for the rest of your life. And I think personally, that's what did it. Lack, a tolerance maybe.
So you're buying into they were doomed from the moment they stepped in because the ground had gone sour by that point due to the
discrimination. Well, the thing is that they were not really all that respectful about the events from the
Mhm.
get-go. So to me, that plays a lot into the folklore of the story as well.
Mhm.
You got to remember that the story of Ellie Kedward relies heavily on people doing wrong by her and
Mhm.
those that she is able to manipulate. And I think those are two things that that happen with Josh, Michael, and Heather. You have people who are not very respectful
Mm.
of the story, and you have people who are easily manipulated.
Mhm.
And I think that's a very dangerous combination, which or not.
I think that's a good point. I think to me, it's the moment that Josh knocks over the cairn is what seals it for them, and it may have already been sealed before that. But I think that when they come upon those three piles of rocks, and Josh, like they're filming it, and Josh knocks it over, I think that's the moment where their fates are sealed at that point. I know that there's a moment where Heather takes, quote unquote, takes responsibility for what goes on and says, this is all my fault. It was my movie. It was my project. But I can't blame her. I think she approaches it with the most amount of respect of the three of them.
At the same time, though, I mean, I'm not placing the blame on Heather because I don't think it's her fault. I do think that they were doomed from the get-go. But I think a big reason why she says it was her fault is because she kind of duped them.
Yes, it's a good point.
She did manipulate Josh and Michael. You know, she said that she scouted the whole area. Right. She said that everybody knew this. It was a lie from the get-go. Right. You know,
well, she never says that she scouted it. She said it was a scouted trip. But she never says, I am the one that she implies that she scouted it, but we know that that's not a fact. Like she's never been there before.
It's almost like word games. Like my kids do that. I hear one of my kids hit my other kid and I'll say, what happened? Well, they did that. It's like, no, responsibility, you know?
Right.
Like,
good point.
Like I think I do think that they were screwed right from the beginning because once you step foot on that land, and I think there is the evil in it, but there's also that spirit of vengeance. You know, yes. I think that there's multiple spirits involved in the whole thing. I'm very much a believer in that stuff in real life. You know, I think that they had no right doing that. They had no right going on that land with their own selfish agendas, you know, and they were disrespectful towards it. So I think it's a combination of it's everybody's fault, to be honest.
And it's interesting because, you know, Heather would go on to say, because she's treated very unfairly, I think, in the movie by the characters, and also once the movie is released, I think she gives such an incredible performance in this. It's so real, so honest, and I think that's what scares a lot of people because it's just this raw nerve that's hit. And you can say that she can be a bit much at times throughout some of the movie. She can get defensive really easily at points, or not maybe be sometimes respectful of Mike and Josh. But at the same time, when they're trapped in this situation, she's the one that keeps it better together than any of them. She's the one that I think has the calmest head of the three of them. And she would go on to say, her mother would get either letters saying, I'm sorry that your daughter is dead, which is nope, she's an actress, or she deserved what she got in that movie, which is really fucked up when you think about it. And she said about her career and playing the part in this role, telling people that I was dead for 9 months before the movie came out did not do any favors for my career.
Well, not at all, because if a film comes out and it's a hit, that's usually when you strike. You know, that's usually when you try to get opportunities for your next job. You know, I think kind of having to be non-existent for the sake of marketing, you know, by the time that everybody had seen Blair Witch, it was kind of an old thing to them. You know, who cares about the people that were in it?
I think there's an inherent misogyny, too, where I think that if you were to switch the roles of Heather and Josh, and this was Josh's project, that he would have been seen as like a leader and keeping it together, and like they should have fallen in line behind him and everyone would have been fine. But because Heather is the one that's really pulling the strings in this and saying, nope, this is where we're going to go, this is our schedule, here's where we are, she is like, Josh would have been seen as kind of like entrepreneurial and innovative for what he wanted to do, and it just didn't work out. Where a lot of blame is put on Heather because she's a female in charge, and God forbid you have like a bossy in charge woman in charge of these two dudes.
I completely agree, and I was gonna say as my my parting gift to the podcast as I really should get going. You gotta take into consideration the societal context of the film, and sort of the era that the film was made in, conceived in, and released in, because it was very, very rare to see a female character lead two male characters in an endeavor that seemed like would be of any significance in the late 90s. And this is 1999. We had The Matrix, which featured Neo as a dude, obviously. We have Fight Club, which it's another conversation entirely. And it really is representative of a society that looks down upon female leaders. So I think a lot of the blame that was put on Heather for supposedly leading the group astray comes from the fact that she was a female in power. And part of me does wonder, like you mentioned, whether the criticism would have been the same if it had been Josh or Michael who were the leads of the project. And it all comes down to this idea that I have. Maybe I'm projecting a little bit onto the film, but the fact that it deals with discrimination and tropes in a very interesting way, both on Ellie Kedward's part and on Heather's part, because I think both are Indian women who are judged in large part because of who they are rather than what they do. And I think that's, at least for me, one of the impactful things about the film, and one of the things that I like about it the most.
Excellent. Marcos, I know guys, you have to bounce. So,
I do have to bounce like a tennis ball. I'm bouncing like a tennis ball.
Marcos, where can people find you online, and what are you working on? What do you want to promote?
You can find me on any social media at Marcos Codas. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with the same handle. I got early on all of those trains, so I got my own name as my handle, which is quite nice. And right now I'm working on finishing the comic book prequel to my horror film Kurusu Serapio, which deals with discrimination and witchcraft, funnily enough. So I'm working on the comic book prequel right now, which is sort of the origin story of how the witch acquired her powers, despite her unwillingness to take part in the grand scheme of things. So you can look forward to that. Just follow me on Twitter, and I'll be sure to send you guys out something to look forward to.
Thank you for being so generous with your time, man, and you have a great night. We're in the middle, so Marcos had to sign off, but we're going to just do a little bit more here, just because, again, this is this is my Halloween, Friday the 13th.
In the spirit of making comparisons to two things that would never be compared, with the kind of train of thought that all of us were on, where if the tables were turned, and it was a male in Heather's part, it would have been accepted. Listeners out there, I know this is a weird recommendation, but I would very much recommend picking up the new Taylor Swift album.
Okay.
Because there is a song on there that addresses exactly what we're talking about. And I'm not even saying that as a jokey way. There's a song called The Man. And you know what? Like, I think it's a very important song to listen to. So listeners, go do that. So, okay, back to Blair Witch.
I think you see it still with toxic fandom now. I mean, look at all the shit that like Rey from Star Wars gets for doing Jedi shit, and like
Captain Marvel.
Like, why doesn't she smile? Why does she not? Why is she like? Why are you asking Captain? No one asked Batman to smile. No one asked the Punisher to smile.
Even more than the smile thing, which is infuriating on itself. But like, my daughter finally has a superhero that she could identify with. Like I was so excited when that movie came out, and then I was reading all these things online, like, well, we're gonna boycott it because we don't need a female lead. Like, are you serious? Like, we're still in the dark ages with that shit.
Right. I mean, 3 years ago, was it 2016 that the Ghostbusters reboot came out, and you have these people like, this is ruining my childhood. It's like, no, man, being a shithead adult is what's ruining your childhood. Like whether or not you like the movie. I'm
not trying to get dark, but being molested ruined my childhood.
Right.
Fucking Ninja Turtles, the Ninja Turtles with William Fichtner didn't ruin my fucking childhood.
Right.
Like, if anyone says that, like, that's the quickest way to get a knuckle sandwich.
Exactly. It's just a unique person.
The original source material is still there. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sorry. Like, I might be in the minority, but fuck you guys. Ghostbusters was fun.
I love it. I think that's a hilarious movie.
I loved that movie. Like, it is light years better than Ghostbusters 2.
Yeah, absolutely is. So that was a little side rant there that we both had. But I really do feel that a lot of the maliciousness that sometimes this movie gets comes from, in part, people feeling like the wool was pulled over their eyes a bit, because something like this, and it's not the first quote-unquote found footage movie, but, Cannibal Holocaust in 1999, you had a small subgroup of people that would have actively sought that movie out and been aware of that movie. Was not. It's kind of like
the film buffs that get super pissed when you mention like Halloween or Black Christmas. Yes, Peeping Tom did it first. I'm a huge fan of Peeping Tom, but what Halloween did and what Black Christmas did, to a lesser extent, business-wise, brought that thing that Peeping Tom had already done, but did it in a way that brought it to audiences.
Yeah.
Blair Witch wasn't the first found footage movie, but it was the first found footage movie that pulled in that much money and brought the technique and the style of found footage into the masses in a way that opened the door for so many other filmmakers.
Exactly. No, that's exactly true. So here's my question, and maybe this will be the last thing we talk about, maybe not, who knows. How much credit should the Blair Witch get for the proliferation of found footage horror movies? I think it's a fairer point to say that Paranormal Activity is the jumping point for so many of these movies getting made. Even though Blair Witch Project makes $248 million worldwide, and that's in 1999 dollars, so it would be even more nowadays, it's not the number one genre film of the year. A little movie called The Sixth Sense comes out right around the time of the Blair Witch Project, and that makes even more money, and that launches the career of M. Night Shyamalan. And it's a crowd-pleasing movie. It's something I didn't see until well after it came out on DVD, but I think it's something that was more palatable for like a mainstream audience, more of what they're used to. And the twist in that movie was, fun and spooky and surprising, but it didn't fuck with your expectations and fuck with your head like Blair Witch Project did. I almost think that like found footage was shied away from for a good 6 or 7, 8 years because of the criticisms that this movie received.
What I feel like this, I think the Blair Witch Project is one of the best horror films around. And the idea of found footage, it was groundbreaking in that. But kind of like what you said, people did shy away. And I do feel like Paranormal Activity, I'm not saying it's a better movie than Blair Witch, because it is not in any way. But with that being said, I think Paranormal Activity and the success of that did make found footage a thing. You know what I mean? Like, Blair Witch did it before that and did it amazingly well. But it was Paranormal Activity that was just like, wow, this made all this money. Let's all make found footage movies for a long time. I feel like that was the one that started it.
I think so too, because I think by that point, filming digitally had gotten cheap enough and easy enough where you could do it. And Paranormal Activity, so when you look at the sequels to both movies, and I love Paranormal Activity, I think it still works. It's still really scary. As we were recording this, I went on to Amazon. I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to release all 6 movies on Blu-ray for $20 in a week. I need to jump on that before it goes up $10 in price. So that's what I was kind of doing in between recording here a little bit. Even though I don't love the other movies quite as much, I think the third one is great. Second one is I think what they did that was smart. Blair Witch Project goes in a completely different direction with its sequel, and it does not work.
No.
I've people that I respect have written about this movie and say it's really good for what it is, and like this is why it's not good. It's not good because it's not good. And then what they do is they take what audiences went to see Blair Witch Project for and completely removed it and did something different. Where Paranormal Activity 2 this is what audience liked about our movie. Well, we're just going to do more of that in the sequel. We're going to amplify what we do. People liked about the first one, and we're going to collect all that money, please. And like the people that run Blumhouse are no dummies.
No, Jason's extremely smart business-wise. But I think what Book of Shadows did, and I think the biggest fuck up when it comes to that movie, and I am using fuck up in an angry way because, dude, how you feel about Mandy, I'm right there with you when it comes to Book of Shadows. I think what it does, and it's the biggest slap to the face, is it gives a middle finger to everything that works about the first film. I think having one of the characters actually say, I saw the Blair Witch Project, I love that movie, or some shit like that. It's like, are you serious? Like, the first film exists as a movie and the second movie, and it's just like, I've never, there are very few movies in my entire life that I've walked out of. I could count all of them on one hand. Jurassic Park, the second one, I walked out of that. I walked out of The Lake House with Keanu Reeves. I don't know why the fuck I was in the theater to see that. I walked out of Book of Shadows. And recently, I almost walked out of 47 Meters Down Uncaged.
Okay.
Those are the only movies in my entire life that I've either said, you know what, fuck this, or wanted to. I think Book of Shadows is the biggest insult to fans of the first film and what made the first film work. And like I said early on in this episode, it baffles me because they got one of the best documentary filmmakers around to make a narrative movie that just did not work.
Well, we're going to talk about that in a lot more depth in about a week, because I have a lot to say about that too. The one note I'll have on it right now is I know Joe Berlinger, and I hope I'm saying that right, but Berlinger said he hated the Blair Witch Project, and he was angry at what Sanchez and Myrick had done because he felt it was irresponsible trying to pass off something as real when it's obvious fiction. He thought that was a very dangerous road to go down. And he's like, look, we elect politicians on sound bites now. It was pretty prescient remarks. And again, getting into where we are with media today. But I think that that's a cop-out in terms of, to me, what Sanchez and Myrick do is just another form of storytelling.
Berlinger said that the Blair Witch Project was irresponsible filmmaking.
Yes.
And he goes on to make one of the biggest shit shows in history.
Right. Just a bad movie, but not an irresponsible.
I am throwing Paradise Lost out my my fucking window right now.
I would not do that. Yeah, I would not.
No, I love it. I love it.
Free the Memphis 3. But it's to me, it's another case, and we'll talk more about it. He didn't want to make the movie, and Artisan kept bugging him. Meanwhile, Sanchez and Myrick had their ideas for the movie. They wanted to go back and tell the story of Rustin Parr in more detail. In 2011 or 12, they kind of wanted to do what The Witch did. They when they saw The Witch, they're like, this is kind of what we wanted to do with our prequel here. We wanted to tell the story of Ellie Kedward overall. And it's shocking to me that these guys never were given the opportunity to go back and tell, because there's so much story to lay out overall. And they would not have done more found footage movies, I believe, but they would have told deep, rich stories within this mythology that I think really would have worked. Much the way that people are looking at like It Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 and going, can we go back and make prequel movies about like the Black Spot Fire and the massacre at the bar? Can we go back and tell like other stories with Pennywise that are prequels? Like, yes, you could do that. I don't know how effective it would be, but I think you could have told some really good stories with what the mythology these guys had so richly drawn out.
I also feel like it's such a great time to warrant those kind of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's 2019, and films like The Witch, or I mean, Oz Perkins just released the trailer for Gretel and Hansel,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels like a cross between The Witch and the Blair Witch Project. Like, god damn, that movie looks great. Like, I would kill to have Sanchez and Myrick come together to make a movie like that. Like, I wish that they would have the opportunity.
Right. And it's going to be interesting when we talk about the 2016 movie, because they really wanted to make another one right around that time. And I think they have some pretty interesting, lightly critical and interesting things to say about what Simon Barrett and Adam Wingard actually created. And I know that when you watch, I don't know, have you ever watched or listened to the commentary for the 2016 Blair Witch?
I haven't. I've only seen it once.
It hurts to listen to that because they recorded it about 2 or 3 weeks after the movie came out and underperformed. And they basically are like, hi, we're the guys that killed any potential for this franchise. Or, hi, if you're listening to this right now, you probably saw Sully in theaters instead. And you can tell Simon Barrett in particular felt this deep hurt. I think they really loved, unlike Berlinger, who like didn't have any affection for this movie, those two had a lot of affection for the original Blair Witch Project, and I think it shows in their movie, which I think is flawed but good, and I think it deserves better than its reputation. And you can tell how much they were hurt. And I don't think they've worked together as filmmakers since, which is a bummer.
No, they haven't. I mean, Wingard went off to do Death Note, and now he's doing the
Godzilla
Kong versus
King Kong.
Godzilla.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm on board for that.
Oh, dude, I am so into that new reboot of that franchise.
All right. So who do we have coming up? Like, we have a couple, before we even get to Book of Shadows, we have a couple more episodes planned just on the Blair Witch Project and the last broadcast. We're actually going to just cover the last broadcast.
We're going to do a whole 10-part series just on the last broadcast. No, I'm just joking. Okay. Now, what we have planned, we have 2 side episodes. Have we announced this already? Can we?
We have not. So let's do it, because let's put our dicks out there right now. This might blow up in our face, but
it blows up my face every time I put my dick out there.
And by the way, if this doesn't happen, I'm blaming you, Kane Hodder. So
you fucker! No, I'm just joking.
Coming at you.
So 2 episodes coming up before we even get to Book of Shadows. We have Ben Rock, who. Marcos Codas, biggest fan club ever. I love it.
He's the architect behind a lot of the mythology. He culled together a lot of. The reason we didn't go super deep into the Curse of the Blair Witch and the Burkittsville 7, because I think we're going to end up doing that with him, and we speak with him later this week, and how he shaped those and how he enhanced, I think, the overall film experience. And who else do we have?
And we have Eduardo fucking Sanchez,
co-director of
one of the directors of the Blair Witch Project, one of the most influential horror films of all time. I am so just ecstatic. I'm so anxious for that episode. It cannot come soon enough.
So I'm hoping we can, because and what's great is I get the impression some people get kind of tired of talking about what they're most known for. And if it kind of becomes like, well, I've said everything I have to say about it already, and the work just speaks for itself. It's like one of the biggest disappointments I've ever had in my life was interviewing Ian MacKaye from Fugazi, a band that meant so much to me. And I interviewed him in like 95 for my old fanzine, and he was such a fucking curmudgeon. I still love their music.
About Fugazi or about Minor Threat too?
Just about fucking everything, man. Just about everything. Which I guess that's who he is, like stupid me for not realizing that. I remember at one point we got in a yell. Oh, I yelled at him because I'm like, I always ended interviews with like, if you could take any Muppet on a date, what Muppet would it be and where would you go? And he's like, I don't know who the Muppets are. And I'm like, dude, you're full of shit. You don't know who the fucking Muppets are.
Oh,
you don't know Kermit the Frog? Like, you self-serious, smug, straight asshole.
Okay, but at the same time, have you ever had, this is really quick, have you ever had any interviews that you thought would be a disaster that were like some of the best ever? Like I sat down, for Blumhouse once, I sat down face-to-face 2 feet away from Henry Rollins and talked about his career. And he was one of the coolest cats ever. Like, oh my God, I walked away from that just even a bigger fan than I already was, which is a lot.
Absolutely. Just the genuine, real deal. I think I interviewed Rollins at one point for my old fanzine, and he was like the real deal, super nice, gracious, like, and he's one of my heroes growing up. So
Danzig was one of the like best conversations I've ever had in my life. And we just talked about Simpsons at Comic-Con for 10 minutes.
Bill Stevenson from The Descendants was another.
Oh, yes,
really good. We talked about masturbation and just a lot of other weird.
You know what we should do? And our listeners might not like this, but we should just have a one-off episode on punk rock and hardcore.
I would be so sad. I would be all for that.
Oh my God! Like,
it would not be a one-off.
Let's get a hold of Blake. Let's go to hold of Blake and try to do a Jawbreaker episode.
I don't know if I could speak to Blake and not burst into tears. It'd be like, remember that time you wrote Jinx Are Moving? That was awesome. That's the whole interview. But I would easily do like side episodes of like the decline of Western civilization, or, like the Descendants documentary. Like, even if we did like, I don't know, charge people. We'll figure something out. I mean, we have some ridiculous shit planned for this, so we'll see where things go. So yes, we're going to be interviewing. That's a long way to say. We're going to be interviewing Eduardo Sanchez, and I'm hoping that we're able to approach things from an angle and maybe get a few things that maybe people have not asked before.
Actually, listeners, and Blair Witch fans. So Marcos, definitely you. Sound off. Give us as many things you want to know about the Blair Witch Project as possible on our Twitter. Like, ask as many questions as possible, because I want this interview with Sanchez to be an extensive, just wonderful episode.
Yes. So we sat down about 4 hours ago to start this recording.
Oh, shit.
With some stops and starts in between for pee breaks and bad internet connections. So this is like, holy shit. Yeah, it does not feel like 4 hours, which is incrable.
I did not realize that.
Yeah. So what we're going to do now is actually going to go back and revisit Jason Goes to Hell, just for Jerry.
Why is he warm?
So just because he's Sean Cunningham. So thank you to all our listeners. I actually have to go eat because I'm feeling a little bit lightheaded at this point from talking so much. But you can find us over at Pod and Pendulum, at Jerry is Just Okay, and at Mike_Snoonian over on Twitter. We'll be back with some bonus episodes. We're looking forward to your feedback. We hope you enjoyed this marathon episode, and we'll be back next week, or actually probably later this week with some more stuff.